The F-111 stands as one of the most debated aircraft in U.S. military history. Despite facing numerous challenges during its early deployment, it evolved into one of the most powerful strike aircraft in the Air Force's arsenal. Designed for multi-role missions, the F-111 introduced cutting-edge technologies like variable sweep wings, enabling peak performance at various speeds, and a terrain-following radar system, allowing low-altitude, high-speed flight over shifting landscapes. However, efforts to adapt it into an interceptor ended in costly failure. Despite being over 50 years old, the F-111's exceptional capabilities endured. Advanced technological innovations made it faster and more lethal, leaving it with few competitors in its category. In 1958, Tactical Air Command, TAC, the Air Force unit overseeing ground attack missions, operated the F-105 Thunderchief, known for its mechanical issues and limited agility, though it was designed specifically for long-range strike missions. The F-105 was designed to carry nuclear bombs at high speed over long distances. While it wasn't intended for conventional air warfare in Vietnam, it became the best option TAC had for air combat, though the conflict exposed its weaknesses. The demands of the Vietnam mission, combined with the fuel-hungry F-105's short range, required low-level flying, making it vulnerable to guided missiles. The Thunderchief was limited to daytime bombing and frequently needed fighter escorts. It also required long, conventional runways. From the outset, TAC recognized that new technology would soon render the F-105 obsolete. Even as it entered service, TAC was already developing its replacement, the TFX project. The TFX fighter bomber would incorporate new materials, microcircuit technology, and innovative engineering concepts, including solid-state electronics that would give the plane fantastic avionics capabilities. Turbofan engines equipped with afterburners provided additional thrust. Most notably, the variable swing wing promised to significantly improve the maneuverability of the otherwise heavy aircraft. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was developing a new high-tech aircraft for fleet defense meant to replace the F-4 Phantom. Although the F-4 eventually served both branches, the Navy and Air Force had traditionally developed aircraft separately to meet their distinct needs. In 1961, newly appointed Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara introduced a change. A former Ford Motor Company executive, McNamara aimed to eliminate bureaucratic waste, and the high costs of separately developed aircraft became an obvious target for cuts. He pushed for standardization, instructing both services to adopt a single aircraft design suitable for the Air Force and Navy. By January 1962, after several rounds of competition, the Pentagon narrowed the choices to two contenders. Boeing's 818 model, though favored by both branches, lacked enough common design features. The competing design came from a collaboration between General Dynamics and Grumman Corporation. This design boasted a high degree of commonality in parts for both services. The only significant differences were in the landing gear, wing length, and nose. Here are mock-ups of the two nose designs, the Navy's B model and the Air Force's A model. McNamara was impressed with the proposal, and in November 1962, an order was placed for 18 Air Force and 5 Navy aircraft. The plane was now designated the F-111. Assembly took place at General Dynamics' Convair Division plant in Fort Worth. Remarkably, the first pre-production model was completed 16 days ahead of schedule. And just 25 months after the contract was signed, the first F-111, an Air Force A model, took flight. The F-111's twin-seat configuration featured a unique crew capsule that could be ejected as a complete unit using rockets at any speed, altitude, or even underwater. Once landed or surfaced, the capsule served as a survival shelter. Additionally, the F-111 was the first aircraft to enter full production with afterburning turbofan engines. The F-30 engine provided fuel efficiency and extended range, while the afterburners enabled rapid takeoff and boosted speed. The General Dynamics design further maximized range by utilizing every available space for fuel storage. Even without external wing tanks, the F-111 boasted a range of over 2,500 nautical miles. With aerial refueling or external tanks, the aircraft could operate virtually anywhere, anytime. Without external fuel, all wing hardpoints were available to carry a vast array of weaponry, while additional ordnance could be loaded into the internal bomb bay. The F-111 was versatile enough to deploy almost any weapon in the Air Force's arsenal, from the M61 Vulcan cannon to freefall nuclear bombs. It could also release foil as an electronic countermeasure and flares to mislead heat-seeking missiles. One of the TFX project's original requirements was the ability to land on short, improvised runways, which General Dynamics achieved with its innovative high-flotation, variable terrain landing gear. Another groundbreaking feature was the terrain-following radar, which allowed pilots to select a flight altitude as low as 200 feet. Once set, the aircraft could fly at speeds over 600 miles per hour using forward-scanning radar to automatically adjust altitude, ensuring safe and precise low-level flight. In manual mode, the F-111 allowed pilots to use radar-gathered information displayed on cockpit instruments, enabling night and all-weather flight while staying low enough to evade radar detection. The F-111 was the first production aircraft to feature variable swing wings, though the concept dates back to World War II. Messerschmitt had developed several swing wing designs, including the P-1101, which never flew, but inspired the post-war American Bell X-5, a successful test aircraft. Similarly, Grumman's Jaguar demonstrated swing wing potential, though it was not further developed. The F-111's wings could be swept back into delta configuration for high-speed flight, set to an intermediate position for efficient mid-range travel, or fully extended forward for takeoff, landing, and low-speed flight. This flexibility allowed the aircraft to adapt mid-flight to different mission needs. Inside the wings, complex mechanisms, including flaps, slats, and fuel storage systems, operated in tandem. General Dynamics designed a specialized wing glove that acted as an airfoil, allowing the forward slats to function smoothly. Development of the Air Force's F-111A model progressed steadily through the early 1960s as new technology was thoroughly tested. Both General Dynamics and the Air Force were satisfied with the performance of their cutting-edge aircraft. However, Grumman, tasked with developing the Navy's F-111B variant, encountered more challenges. The Navy was displeased with the B model, but due to Secretary of Defense McNamara's emphasis on standardization, they had little choice but to proceed with it. Unfortunately, the F-111B prototypes were too heavy for carrier operations, and two costly weight reduction programs failed to shed the necessary 20,000 pounds. Worse still, these modifications severely compromised standardization. Although the F-111B was an impressive aircraft, it never entered service. In July 1968, the Navy canceled the F-111B program, in favor of developing its own dedicated fleet defense fighter, Grumman's F-14 Tomcat. Meanwhile, the Air Force pressed on with the F-111A, launching the Harvest Reaper program to prepare it for combat. By early 1968, after 8 months of testing, the decision was made to deploy the F-111 for real-world combat evaluation in Vietnam. 6 F-111A aircraft from the 474th Tactical Fighter Wing were deployed from Nellis Air Force Base to Thailand, where they operated out of the Royal Thai Air Force Base at Tak Ly. This combat testing and evaluation program, known as Combat Lancer, positioned the F-111s within striking distance of North Vietnam. However, the results were mixed. Within 2 weeks, 2 F-111s disappeared without a trace, and less than a month later, another was lost, though this time the crew ejected and the wreckage was recovered for analysis. The losses generated negative publicity in the U.S., with some media reports incorrectly attributing them to enemy ground fire. After 50 missions, Operation Combat Lancer ended, and the 3 surviving F-111s returned to Nellis for further evaluation. Engineers later determined that the losses were due to a failure in the aircraft's large horizontal stabilizer. In December 1969, another F-111A from Nellis crashed after losing a wing, resulting in the grounding of the entire fleet. The entire F-111 program came under intense scrutiny after the crashes. The wing problem was traced to a failure in the wing pivot box, marking difficult times for General Dynamics. The high cost of developing the twin designs, substantial cost overruns, and the losses in Vietnam led to harsh criticism from the media and political opponents. General Dynamics defended the F-111 as a technological pioneer, arguing that incorporating so many new systems inevitably came with challenges. Both the Air Force and General Dynamics recognized that, despite the setbacks, the F-111 had great potential, prompting efforts to improve the design. Despite its long development period, few external changes were made. One notable difference was the replacement of the moving air intake cowl with a demand-activated inlet door, distinguishing early A versions from later models. Once the modification program was complete, the F-111 was nearly flawless. Tactical Air Command eventually used 4 different strike versions of the F-111, which looked nearly identical externally, but varied significantly in cost due to differences in their electronic systems. The F-111 was also adopted by the Strategic Air Command, SAC, to replace its older B-52s and B-58 Hustlers, and was designated the FB-111. This SAC version featured a longer wing and reinforced landing gear, but was otherwise similar to its Tactical Air Command counterparts. Originally designated a fighter, the F-111 also served as a strategic bomber alongside B-52s. In 1972, 4 years after its initial combat tests, the F-111 returned to Vietnam for Operation Linebacker. Within 33 hours of departing from Nellis Air Force Base, the aircraft were striking targets in Hanoi. This time, the performance was notably improved. Operating solo or in pairs, TAC's 474th Fighter Wing achieved 4,000 successful sorties in 6 months, with only 6 aircraft lost, giving the F-111 the highest survival ratio of any combat aircraft in the theater.
Okay, we're coming up on our entry point in about 5 miles. We'll be turning right to a heading of 101.
Okay, coming right here. I'll go out back and bypass on the radar altimeter. Put the left channel in TF and we'll put the right channel over to the situation.
Okay.
Ready to start on down deck?
Roger.
Okay, auto TF, start down.
Okay, I'm picking up ground returns now.
Yeah, attitude indicator looks good.
Okay.
Coming on down the E-scope, ground returns coming in, and the radar altimeter clicked in at 5,000.
Roger, we should level off about 500.
Looking down to 1,000 here now, coming up 700, 600, and it's leveling off real fine, 550.
Okay, it looks good over here. I've got a ridge coming up at 5 miles on the scope, and it's dead ahead, going to 5 over 15.
Okay. Looks like it's about 3 miles on my E-scope now.
Right, okay, we should be passing about 10 seconds. Okay, I'm going to target, and we're in target, and I'm picking up returns. It looks good. Crosshairs are falling good.
Got the captain's mark.
The F-111's reputation was greatly enhanced by this success, and criticism of the plane diminished. The effectiveness of the swing-wing concept was later validated by the Soviet Union, which modeled its Su-24 Fencer closely on the F-111 design. Two major modifications significantly increased the F-111's capabilities, one of which was developed by Grumman, the company behind the Navy's F-111 model. Grumman's EF-111 Raven project found another important use for the versatile F-111 airframe. This initiative involved taking early model F-111s, stripping them down to their basic components, and then completely rebuilding them as electronic countermeasures platforms. In the Raven, a second crew member operates advanced equipment to disrupt enemy radar, creating a protective shield for other attacking aircraft. The Raven can be deployed in 3 ways. First, as a standoff jammer to protect other aircraft from a distance. Second, as close air support, flying at low altitudes to provide electronic cover for ground attack aircraft. And third, by penetrating deep into hostile airspace with attacking forces to jam enemy radar. This system was extensively utilized during the Persian Gulf conflict. Additionally, a major modification fitted to new F-111s is the Pave TAC system, a self-contained standoff weapons delivery system. Pave TAC combines an infrared TV camera with a laser rangefinder and designator to accurately target guided bombs or missiles. Although Pave TAC components are integrated throughout the aircraft, the primary component is the Pave TAC pod, which is mounted on a rotating cradle in the bomb bay and retracted when not in use. The Pave TAC pod is equipped with electro-optical sensors, an infrared TV camera, and lasers, allowing it to provide comprehensive coverage beneath the aircraft. Its movable pod head ensures that targets can be tracked accurately. At about 3 miles from the target, it is identified on the TV display, and infrared imagery is activated to enhance tracking precision. The video picture enables extremely accurate target tracking. Once the target is located, the laser-guided bomb is released. The aircraft then maneuvers away to avoid the blast and potential anti-aircraft fire. The forward-looking infrared continues to track the target and keep the laser aimed. 5 seconds before impact, the laser is activated to guide the weapon. In practice, this system was used during an AGM Maverick missile launch, where the weapons systems operator places the missile crosshairs on the target, locks it in, and then launches the missile. Once launched, the TV video feed disappears, and the Pave TAC's infrared video is employed for aiming, tracking, and assessing the strike's success. On April 14, 1986, F-111s from the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing departed RAF Lakenheath as part of the American strike mission against Libya. In response to a series of Libyan-sponsored terrorist acts, the United States planned to strike 5 key targets. Colonel Paul Fazakerly, from the 48th Fighter Wing, provided insights into the mission.
The Navy's very capable of doing this kind of a mission, and they could drive carriers up there, and that's why we buy aircraft carriers, project power and drop bombs. But in this particular case, we had 5 targets that we wanted to take out pretty much simultaneously. The Bonita and Benghazi were the airfields to the east of the Gulf of Sidra. And then we had 3 targets in the Tripoli area, the downtown headquarters complex, the swimming pool, which is an underwater demolition team headquarters, and a frogman-type training center, as well as a 3rd target, which was their airfield that they used to use their IL-76 transport aircraft to transport their terrorist activities, or to use to support the terrorist activities. So with 5 targets and the amount of defenses that were right around the Tripoli airport and the town itself, it became an atmosphere where using the A6 off of a carrier, it's a little bit slower, it flies a little bit higher, it doesn't have quite the capability to hit the targets as well as the F-111. It was decided at the 11th hour that it would be better if this would be a joint mission, since we had practiced that contingency option. And so they decided the National Command Authority decided to go ahead with that plan as a joint option, and the 111 would be best suited for going into the area that was the most heavily defended. And it could survive much better and hit the targets with minimum collateral damage, where the A6 would have I think a problem in that area without an enormous amount of support. So the Air Force picked up the western targets, which were in downtown Tripoli area, and the Navy picked up the 2 airfields to the east. And it worked very good because we had trained with the Navy. We had a Navy liaison officer in the squadron, and everyone was comfortable with the geographical separation of the 2 services, and yet working together, sharing a lot of mutual supports. In the 48th Wing at Lakenheath, we took off from home and flew over 14 hours. It was just about 14 hours and 10 minutes was the longest mission. And refueled 3 or 4 times, maybe even as much as 5, because we wanted to optimize our refueling on the way down to be as close to full tanks just prior to drop-off down in the Italian area. There was no problem staying awake and being alive and on the way down, as far as the crews commented. We had a little bit of problems with airplanes because the F-111 is typically a 2.5-hour mission airplane. When you fly it for 5-6 hours and then go hit a target, who knows what's going to be left of it. So even though we had tracked the airplane's maintenance capability, it was really gutsy to take an old airplane like that far and then expect it to perform. So of the 24 airplanes that we had started with, we took 18 down there, and then of the 18, we had actually 11 go into the target area. So we did have some maintenance problems, and we fully expected to with taking an older airplane that far. And we had very, very strict rules of engagement because we didn't want to throw bombs off into the middle of the town. And this is the route that was flown. That's a picture of the attack radar. And the attack radar on an F-111, which you see there, exercise and train following radar, is the key to terrain avoidance. The paved tack pod rotates out of the bay, as you see in this picture. And the whole bay rotates in order to have your laser capability to spot a target. That's the laser picture, the forward-looking infrared radar. The airplane tosses the bombs and then turns in a 135-degree wing-over move, puts the crosshairs right on the target. Now, you see the target there is the headquarters complex. And to the right and off to the bottom of the screen is the tent, which was not a target. Most folks think that was the target. But the crosshairs are exactly right on the point where they should be, and the laser will be turned on at the last 8 seconds of the flight of the bomb, and the bomb will come in from above and destroy the target. In this particular case, the bombs landed right at the front door and skipped into the headquarters. There was some good BBC footage that showed it all pretty much gutted out the next day. There's a clip of ZSU-23-4 and just different kinds of artillery. There was a lot of artillery barrages and flares fired off. The flares were the thing that was most disheartening, really, from a standpoint of a guy that wants to go down and fly at night and not see anything like that. They distract you quite a bit. The other target that you're going to look at here is the airfield. The airplane is turning to the right because there was a little bit of an error in the radar offsets, but now the forward-looking radar has got it on a paved tack. The bombs are gone, and you see of the 12 bombs, 1 comes off slick, which didn't go off, and then 11, which you see circled, they're scattered out in about a 700-foot by 300-foot pattern. They would go ahead and take out the IL-76s on the ramp at the Tripoli airport. And then you see a rear view of them hitting the targets. And then after the mission, we would, the strike force would fly out into the Gulf and be protected by the Navy in case someone was chasing you, and then right on out the same way we came in, with a couple of refuelings on the way home. What you like to see is every single airplane hit every single target with perfect footage of the film. Well, that just doesn't happen. So we had a lot of folks that had to pull off to avoid collateral damage. We had people with airplane problems, and a lot of folks have said, well, the airplane just didn't hold up, and there was problems, and it didn't do the mission as well as expected. Well, the mission was to have visible damage on 3 targets. You just saw very, very vivid visible damage on 2, and there was another tape of the 3rd, which shows the swimming pool with the water draining out of it. That was the mission. And that's all that counts, is if you can show that you have destroyed or had visible damage on those 3 targets that were tied to the terrorism activities. And with those tapes, it's obvious that the mission was accomplished. And that's the overall good part, is that it was accomplished. It was accomplished by the F-111, an old aircraft. The aircraft is still accomplishing those type missions. I think that the F-111F, the one with the laser capability, will be with us for quite a while. And hopefully, my own biases are that we get those kind of capabilities tested and worked into some of our newer airplanes, especially ones that we can put on aircraft carriers and project that kind of precision power.
Although Robert McNamara's vision of a multi-service fighter bomber did not fully materialize, the aircraft he approved evolved into one of the finest tactical and strategic bombing platforms. The F-111, with its versatile airframe, also excelled in the critical role of airborne electronic warfare. Its outstanding performance in conflicts such as Vietnam, Libya, Panama, and the Persian Gulf has solidified its reputation and vindicated its initially controversial design. Today, several F-111 aircraft are preserved in aviation museums around the world, offering enthusiasts a chance to explore its design and historical significance. These exhibits highlight the aircraft's technological advancements and operational history. Its innovative design, technological achievements, and operational versatility have left a lasting impact on aerospace engineering. The F-111 Aardvark remains a significant milestone in military aviation history. From its development in the 1960s to its retirement in the late 1990s, played a crucial role in modern air warfare. Reflecting on its legacy, it's evident that the F-111's influence extends far beyond its years of active service.
Okay, as I mentioned during the briefing, what we'll do today is go through the normal takeoff and climb out. We'll go up to 20,000 feet and go through some wing sweeps. After you get the feel, we'll check out some of the normal flight characteristics. Then we'll come back, okay? You'll notice the rudder begins to take effect at about 50 knots, but use nose wheel steering until you reach 80 knots. Be careful you don't start your rotation too early. The procedure is to lead your takeoff speed by 15 knots. The ideal is to arrive at your takeoff speed and your 10-degree pitch attitude simultaneously, and she flies herself off. And watch that angle. The tail bumper hits at about 13 degrees. You have to use a little forward stick right after takeoff to stop the rotation. The main thing is to hold a 10-degree alpha during initial climb. When you retract the gear and flaps, you'll have to correct for a slight nose-down pitch, but the trim change will be small. It's recommended that you retract the flaps in 2 steps to prevent big alpha changes. You will also see the angle of attack increase to make up for the loss of lift when the flaps are retracted. I'm going to extend the slats for a minute to show you what will happen if you exceed 270 knots with the slats extended. What happens is that you may get a 2 cycle per second pitch oscillation. This will continue until you either reduce your airspeed or retract the slats.
How soon after the flaps and slats are retracted can you sweep the wings?
Immediately. The wings should never be moved during any asymmetric or high G maneuver, but as soon as you're in a clean configuration, the wing should be swept to 26 degrees. This is the position for climb at most high-altitude subsonic flight. Notice you get an alpha increase as the wings come back. This takes place anytime the wings are moved. You remember why?
Because it changes 2 things, the lifting capacity of the wing and the center of lift. These 2 plus the center of gravity, that is, the center of the aircraft weight, influence tail force. As the wings come back, movement of the wing mass moves the center of gravity back, and the center of lift is moved back, but a greater distance than the CG. An aft sweep reduces the lifting capacity of the wing. The end result is a nose-down pitch, which means that more up elevator and increased angle of attack is needed to maintain level flight. This up elevator change also causes a slight reduction of lift.
That's right. The reverse, of course, is true when you sweep the wings forward.
It must be hard getting a balance between speed, wing sweep, and alpha.
Not especially. Your angle of attack indicator is the best guide. As you increase airspeed, alpha will decrease slightly because as your speed increases, the wing can lift the same weight at a lower angle of attack. To maintain your desired alpha, you sweep the wings back a little. This, you recall, reduces the wing's lifting capacity, and the angle of attack must be increased a little to maintain level flight.
Doesn't command augmentation help maintain proper angle of attack?
No, it's only effective during maneuver flight. What happens is that when you move the stick in order to command G's, the pitch damper adds enough elevator to get the maneuver started. At low speeds, when control effectiveness is low, stick movement is augmented by the damper to give you the needed large elevator deflection. As the speed increases, less elevator deflection is needed, and the damper works to give you less deflection with the same stick movement. In a nutshell, the command augmentation system influences the elevator deflection so that you get the same G response for a given stick force, no matter what the flight altitude or speed.
Crazy, but how does this affect stall? I understand that this airplane doesn't make a classic stall brake, and a stall can sneak up on you.
That's right, especially at low speeds. You just have to be careful about applying large up elevator commands with slats and flaps extended. because the command augmentation system can give you high pitch rates and large angles of attack in a hurry, so you should keep a check on the alpha indicator during all pitch-up maneuvers. But you still get plenty of stall warning, even though there is no buffet to speak of. When the sum of the pitch rate and the angle of attack equal 18 degrees, the rudder pedal shaker is activated.
I can feel it.
This is as high as you should normally take it in alpha, but let's go on up so you can see what happens. When you get close to 25 degrees, you'll notice wing rock and loss of directional stability. This is your signal that unless you stop your alpha from increasing, you'll enter post-stall gyrations and become susceptible to a spin. What fools you is that control effectiveness remains good even at these high alphas. In the clean configuration, the characteristics of high alpha are about the same, except you'll feel buffet even before you reach limit alpha. This buffet becomes stronger as you increase angle of attack. Again, there isn't much G-feel, so you've got to keep an eye on the angle of attack indicator. You still get rudder pedal shaker as you approach limit alpha, and when you get about 22 to 25 degrees alpha, wing rock begins. At 28 degrees, post-stall gyrations will probably occur, and you can get into a spin. But elevator control is good, and you can quickly recover.
What about roll control?
At subsonic speeds, it is advisable to keep the wings 45 degrees or more forward. This allows spoiler operation for maximum roll control at the lower speeds.
What kind of control do you get with the wings back so far that the spoilers won't operate?
Very good. There are no problems as long as you keep your speed up. But if you lose speed at these high sweep angles, you develop a high sink rate. If you fail to notice this, you can lose a lot of altitude in a hurry. To get out of this, you can increase speed or sweep your wings forward. Okay, let's go transonic. In preparation for transonic flight, the wings should be swept back to about 50 degrees. This locks the spoilers out, and all roll control now comes from the horizontal stabilizers. At subsonic speeds, this does reduce the roll control, and it is recommended that under these conditions, rolls should not exceed 60 degrees of bank. At high speed, roll performance is good due to the high dynamic pressure and low angle of attack. Some slight directional trim changes may be noticed during transonic flight, especially at altitudes lower than 25,000 feet. Below 10,000 feet, there may be a slight Dutch roll and a little buffeting, but this passes as you go supersonic. Otherwise, she slices right through. At high altitude, supersonic flight is pretty routine throughout the entire Mach range. Response and damping characteristics are good. Wing sweep should be full aft to obtain the best performance. You can make a quick deceleration by sweeping the wings forward to 50 degrees to increase drag. This allows you to either maintain your power or to pull it back. Trim changes are small during these sweeps. Okay, let's get ready for our approach and landing. For penetration, the wing should be swept to 26 degrees, so that later you can use the slats and flaps. For landing, it may sometimes be necessary to move the wings farther forward.
Why not go straight to 16 degrees? Wouldn't this give even better low-speed performance?
For one thing, your speed would be slower, but the main thing is you've got to watch your aft CG limits. For instance, flying at 10 degrees alpha, as you do during your approach, your elevators are deflected upward. Your total deflection available from 0 to maximum is 25 degrees. If you're pulling 12 degrees, this leaves plenty for control during landing. But if your CG is too far forward, the elevators will have to be deflected farther to hold the nose up. This cuts down the amount of available control to an unacceptable limit, in this case, 5 degrees. On the other hand, if your CG is too far aft, the airplane becomes unstable and hard to fly. This is why you can't always land with a 16-degree wing. An important thing to remember is that the elevator position gives you a clue as to the location of your CG relative to both the forward and aft limits. With wings at 26 degrees, the elevator trailing edge must be between 6 degrees and 14 degrees up. With the wings at 16 degrees, the elevator trailing edge must be between 4 degrees and 9 degrees up.
What happens if your wings are as far forward as they'll go, and your CG is still too far forward?
Then you'll have to shift the CG aft by fuel management. Obviously, you can't wait until you're on your final approach to adjust your CG. For this reason, a center of gravity check is mandatory before making your approach. When you're in a 1G attitude below 10,000 feet, with 26-degree wings and speed brake retracted, and the indicated airspeed is between 250 and 300 knots, check the elevator position indicator. Trailing edge deflection should be between 2 degrees up and 1 degree down. In other words, very close to zero. If the trailing edge is too high, the center of lift can be eased forward by sweeping the wing forward to bring the trailing edge within tolerances. If the trailing edge should be too low, you must either move the center of gravity forward or the wings aft. Obviously, you've got a problem here because you can't go back beyond 26 degrees and still have your slats and flaps. This means that if the trailing edges are still too far down, you'll have to manage fuel to bring the CG forward. This procedure is critical in order to ensure a stable airplane and plenty of elevator control during landing. You should be making your turn to downwind at 250 knots. When straight and level on your downwind leg, put the gear down and extend the slats. When you extend the slats, you'll get a small pitch oscillation. Under 250 knots, this will decay within 5 or 6 cycles. At higher speeds, it will probably hang on until your speed drops. The flaps are extended by a two-step procedure. First, to 15 degrees, then when the speed drops below 220 knots, pull down. When on final approach, at 10 degrees alpha, recheck your elevator position. It's a heck of a feeling to pull the stick all the way back and have nothing happen. In this airplane, acceleration from idle to full military is relatively slow, so you have to keep good throttle control. During low-speed turns, you will get some adverse yaw, but your AYC and yaw damper should take care of this. You should roll out for your final approach with an alpha of about 10 degrees. Keep a close eye on your indexer. Adjust your sink rate with throttle. It should be about 600 to 700 feet a minute. When you come into ground effect, the nose will tend to pitch down. A little back stick will correct for this. Keep your stick movement smooth. Abrupt or heavy moves may momentarily increase your rate of descent. As you begin your flare, reduce your power slightly. The flare should be small, only enough to cut your sink rate about in half. This gives you a positive touchdown with immediate spoilers, so that you don't duck walk down the runway.
Do you get much change in characteristics when you're carrying stores?
Not significantly. Our next flight will be with external stores. You will notice that stores do kill a little lift, so you will have to fly with a slightly higher alpha. The change in the CG and the inertia of the extra weight will make it a little sluggish, especially in rolls. When you approach transonic, you may notice a little buffeting. This is caused by the shock waves chasing around the stores. Where you really have to take care is landing with stores. External stores move the CL forward, which means you've got to watch that your elevator position is above the lower limit. Internal stores, however, move the CG forward. In this case, you've got to watch the upper elevator limit. In order to get your trailing edge deflection within limits, you may have to manage fuel. Stall characteristics are the same with or without stores, except that buffet starts at a slightly lower angle of attack. The limit angle of attack is the same as without stores.
What about air refueling? Do they give you any problems there?
Refueling is easy in this airplane either with or without stores. Normally the wings are set at 26 degrees, but it can be done with them back as far as 50 degrees. Military power is adequate for most gross weights. In extreme cases, you can go to afterburner on one engine and use the other for maneuvering. But you'll find that the airplane is pretty sensitive behind the boom, and only small inputs are needed to maintain position.
Boy, there's a lot to remember.
Generally, there are only a few major points to keep in mind. Never change wing position during asymmetric or high G maneuvers. With the wings at 45 degrees or farther forward, the spoilers will provide improved roll performance. Watch for a rapid buildup of sink rate during low-speed flight with the wings back of 45 degrees. Check the elevator position before making landing approach to ensure plenty of elevator control. The center of gravity adjustment can be made by shifting the wing slightly. You will get adverse yaw during low-speed turns with the slats out. Watch your alpha, especially during the landing approach. Stalls do not have the classic brake and can sneak up on you. Your flare at touchdown should be just enough to reduce sink rate by about half. This will give you a firm touchdown to activate the spoiler squat switch. Basically, the FB-111 is smooth flying and responsive and handles much like any other airplane.
You ready to give it a try? Thought you'd never ask.
I just spared this flight here that's getting ready to take the angle to take off. We've got over 50 airplanes involved in this strike force, and it was going to be a big raid up near the Hanoi area, but the weather's bad. Now they're going to various other areas. A spares job, for every 4 airplanes we launch one spare off the end of the runway. In case one of the airplanes that we're having trouble with, they can fill in any 4 positions, any one of the 4 positions. He's usually a leader, so in case the leader aborts, he can fill in that spot. You can see this flight taking off now, and the airplane standing by is the spare. He'll be coming back up like me probably pretty soon. Why we have a spare out there, because if we didn't, we'd never get another airplane up in time.
This is an F-105G, the Wild Weasel variant of the Thunderchief. The last mutation of a plane that when first produced was the biggest single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft ever built. The F-105 was an awesomely powerful weapon, and in the skies of Vietnam, it was to become known as the one-man Air Force. The designer of the F-105 was Alexander Catvelli, chief designer at Republic and no stranger to the concept of big fighter aircraft. For he had been the designer of the World War II P-47 Thunderbolt, the biggest single-engine fighter of its day, which has been produced in large numbers and had proved itself a sturdy workhorse not only in its intended role as an air superiority or escort fighter, but as a fighter bomber in the tactical support vision. Work on Advanced Project 63, the series of design studies that led to the 105, commenced in 1951, at the height of the Korean War. Essentially as a privately funded update of Republic's F-84. The AV-4 had been developed as a jet Thunderbolt for the escort and tactical fighter bomber roles. In Korea, it proved not up to the escort role in competition with the MiG-15, but it performed well in the ground attack. The 84 straight wings were part of a very conventional overall design. And indeed, the plane's latter manifestations exhibited swept wings more appropriate to the potential speed of the jet. But with the experience of Korea to guide them and the rapid pace of technological development to compel them, the design team soon realized that they were setting out to design a completely new plane. As the team at Republic was setting out on their project, the counterparts of North American company had just received US Air Force support for their F-100 Super Sabre, first of the series of planes known as the Sentry Fighters that were to cover the multiple fighter roles that perceived as the Air Force moved to supersonic capability. Starting life as a reworking of the successful F-86 Sabre, the F-100 was originally described as an air superiority fighter, but its latter variations added fighter bombing capabilities. With a maximum speed of 860 miles an hour, the Hun was USA's first supersonic fighter, and, particularly in tactical support role, was to prove valuable in Vietnam. The next plane was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, designed as a penetration fighter and escort fighter. The rapidity of development in aviation can be judged by the fact that, though only ordered 12 months later than the F-100, the 101 had a top speed of 1,100 miles an hour. Again, the plane developed tactical capability in its later models, and it was used extensively in Vietnam, most notably in photo reconnaissance. Third of the Sentry Fighters was the F-102 Delta Dagger from General Dynamics, an all-weather interceptor commenced in 1950. Capable of 820 miles an hour, it proved only a moderate success, but naturally was to develop to become the F-106, which had a top speed of 1,500 miles an hour. The Lockheed Starfighter, the F-104, ordered in March 1953, sought flight performance at all costs as an air superiority fighter. Basically a manned missile, the 1,400 mile per hour 104 had a checkered career, but has demonstrated amazing longevity as a tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft. At Republic, Clark Belly's team working on Advanced Project 63. After a program that ran to 108 configurations had emerged with a design for a single-engine, single-seat tactical fighter bomber with the capacity to carry nuclear weapons and an internal bomb bay. This plane, the 105A, was given Air Force approval in September 1952, originally with the intention of mass production, but in the end only 2 were built. The 105, rounding out the Sentry Fighters, was the first purpose-designed tactical strike aircraft ordered for the United States Air Force. The perception of need for such a plane derived from a combination of Korean battlefield experience, geopolitics, and interest-service competition between the strategic and tactical air commands of the USAF. For TAC, the 105, in addition to opening up parameters of their new conventional role, brought with it the capability to carry nuclear weapons over a long range, with a corresponding rise in their prestige to rival that of the Strategic Command. The Tactical Air Command support of the 105 was to prove vital to the project as the plane went through its difficult early years. Virtually all the technology and engineering of aircraft were being revolutionized at once, in response to the myriad physical changes inherent in the transition of the age of supersonic flight, and the F-105 was to have plenty of developmental problems in the years ahead. But what made the huge fighter so special was its large internal capacity. The atom bombs, more reminiscent of drums than weapons, gave it a potency far beyond any competitor. For the F-105A, significant breakthroughs in understanding the effects of transonic drag, together with some inherent deficiencies, had already seen the design superseded. It first flew for the 3 years after the USAF go-ahead, and then by then its internal systems had changed beyond recognition. Also by then, manufacture of its replacement was underway. The third F-105 was the first of the B model, We see it here on the 26th of May 1956 as it taxis to its takeoff point for its first flight. This was the first 105 to have a power plant big enough to match its size, and major external changes had also been incorporated, chief among which was the area ruling, which had rescued the F-102 from its drag and turbulence problems. This had replaced the straight lines on the A model with a slim hip over the wing. A massive 4-pedaled air brake now dominated the previously clean lines of the engine exhaust, and there had also been changes made to the air intakes, giving the Thunderchief its characteristic nostrils. A larger tail area had increased stability. These and other changes have resulted in a plane with the capacity to double the speed of sound. Perhaps symbolically, this first flight was to be beset by almost fatal problems. It was intended that the flight be short, little more than a quick circuit. But when it came time to lower the wheels, there was no response from the nose wheel. Raising and lowering the wheels had no effect. The nose wheel would not budge. Rather than abandon the plane, it was decided to attempt a wheels-up landing, and so the test pilot set the machine down on a long, dangerous slide across the salt. Eventually, the plane came to a halt, and emergency crews converged on the site in the slowly clearing dust. The crash was more than an intense embarrassment for a project that was already being scrutinized as excessively expensive and troubled by technical problems. However, it was still possible to argue that the problems were being solved in ways that consistently improved the overall capability of the plane, and that even as simply as a test program, the 105 was revolutionizing the understanding not only of the science of aviation, but the potentiality of a tactical aircraft. The cause of the crash was soon identified in the new air intake controls, which at the high thrust settings were jamming the wheel in a position, a fairly simple thing to correct. One other thing that the crash demonstrated was something that those who flew the Thunderchief in action came to know and approve of its toughness. The plane was lifted, the undercarriage was lowered, and the prototype was towed away to be mended and rebuilt. Rebuilt, the plane rejoined the test program. As work progressed on tying together all the systems and ironing out all the bugs in the components, the engineers were dealing with concepts and forces they could only barely control, and overcoming the snags as they appeared. It's difficult to think of any other way that these problems, theoretical and practical, could have kept up with the intense scramble of technical development. In being the first plane capable of both air-to-air fighting and air-to-ground semi-automatic weapons delivery, the plane relied on avionics packages far in advance of anything previously attempted. Among these advanced facilities were radar models for air search, contour mapping, terrain following, and automatic tracking of air and ground targets even in blind conditions. Throughout its life, the 105 was to almost constantly receive new and updated facilities, but even from the first, this was a plane that was far ahead of its time. The rebuilt plane was allocated to conduct the spin testing program, a spin recovery parachute which installed on the tail of the plane. This required removing a panel to afford room for the chute and removing the air brake so that, if needed, the chute would be unimpeded. Trials on the chute demonstrated that it worked satisfactorily. The aim of spin testing is to ensure that the plane can be recovered from a spin to normal flight. That, once control has been lost, it can be regained. Of course, the first thing to do in such a test is to lose control of the aircraft deliberately. Then, the test pilot sits there while his plane plummets through the air for a specified duration, and then he attempts recovery. This is not for the faint-hearted. The emergency spin recovery parachute was not needed, as the planes proved to have a natural tendency to level out after each revolution, and the pilots were able to resume control fairly easily. However, the airframe still had to be tested, and so the trials went on. "47 times the pilots let go and watched the horizon slide away slickingly as the plane commenced its fall. If you look carefully here, you'll see a pillar of flame leap from the tail of the plane as the engine stalls. Though the flight test proceeded well, the technical problems persisted, with the engine and the avionics still unreliable. The uncertainty of performance was matched by a wider uncertainty about the future of the plane. The original expectation of large production had been amended to 37, then cancelled altogether in December 1953. A reinstated order in February 1954 was for 15 aircraft, but by September this had already come back to 3. In October, it was back to 6. Parallel for the state of flux, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already been repeatedly amended before being first published in December 1954, and, by April 1955, had been changed 3 more times. The men conducting the test series went on with their work, while uncertainty continued to shroud the future of the project. The 105's already considerable range had been augmented by the addition of external fuel tanks, and these two had to be tested to establish the effect they had on the plane, as well as to test the tanks themselves. Throughout 1957, the testing went on, with the test aircraft logging many hours over the desert as the plane was slowly sorted out through multiple modifications. The pre-service evaluations due for completion in November 1959 were to eventually go on until March 1961. Of the specifications added in 1954 was that the F-105 should be capable of in-flight refueling, another recent innovation already being widely used. With an airplane like the F-105, this was a tricky proposition. For the fighter pilot to slow down to the same speed as the tanker left him with insufficient airflow over the wings to maintain lift. The top speed of the tanker and lowest speed of the F-105 were very close, and, as you see, the fighter becomes very hard to maneuver, especially in the turbulence of the larger plane and often stalls entirely. Attempts to alleviate the problem by handing jets to the tankers, as here to a B-29, didn't help all that much. All supersonic fighters had trouble until jet tankers raised the speed of refueling to safer levels. The tests confirmed the difficulty for the pilot of the fighter, and although successful couplings were made, the system remained largely impractical. Not due to any failure of the F-105, but because of the inadequacies of the tankers. Having the drobe trail from the wingtip rather than from the tail of the plane removed the operation from the worst of the larger plane's turbulence, and facilitated matters somewhat, but the tendency to stall still remained. The equipment in use, the long drogue hose, did not make things any easier with the requirement for the pilot of the fighter to maneuver onto the drogue. Not until this necessity was replaced by a system where he simply holds position in relation to the tanker and the operator in the tanker directs the connection was refueling truly a practical affair. The F-105 was equipped with two types of refueling connectors, and these were to see a lot of use in the Thunderchief's career. Back at the end of 1954, our public must have been wondering about the fate of the 105, and their anxiety can have only been slightly alleviated by the bittersweet news that they received in February 1955. The order was lifted back to 15, with the allowance for the rest of the original 34 only if funds were available in the coming fiscal year. To add to this ambiguous news was the unsettling proviso that there'd be a fly-off against the North American company's F-107, an updated, high-powered, and re-eclipsed Super Sabre variant. Had the 107 been compared to almost any other plane at the time, it may have outperformed it. However, the 105 was a rather special opponent, and the performance of the controversial big plane was beginning to quell the doubts about its worth. The revisions of the Thunderchief specifications had continued in a stream of expansions of its system's capability. Constant electronic elevations proceeded throughout the plane's development and its operational lifetime, continuing to maintain the F-105 at the forefront of performance. The plethora of design changes meant that the first 15 F-105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. Eventually, there would have been 19. During the test program, of course, the revisions of the plane meant that the trials were regularly extended. The normal flight testing programs were consistently completed with little trouble, as the airframe behaved very well and had admirable flight characteristics. However, the electronics of the newly conceived and developing systems caused continuing delays as their performance was lifted to their supposed specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate what a fine aircraft was evolving in the process. But at the time, eyebrows were being raised as there was considerable skepticism about the plane. On the 28th of May 1958, 3 years later than originally expected, the USAF took delivery of its first operational 105. Fittingly, it was the only one of its subtype. The Air Force pilots had been disappointed to hear that their new mount was in fact a rather large bomber, and had christened the plane in advance rather disparagingly as the Lead Sled, Thunder Thud, or Plane Thud. Now, they got their hands on it for the first time and immediately changed their minds. and thud in particular came to mean F-105. But no longer in any derogatory sense. The big plan was to be universally popular with those who flew them. Not only did it handle and perform as a fighter, but it packed a combination of punches that was truly awesome. Fully laden, a 105 could carry 14,000 pounds of a very wide range of external stores, including all normal bombs, rockets or rocket pods, cannon pods, electronic countermeasures, packed air-to-surface missiles, and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. But almost as the reason for its existence, the Thunderchief also had a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted neatly into the plane. To control the ejection of the bomb, both for accuracy's sake and to ensure the bomb was clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down with a pneumatic rack. The rack was strong enough to be used as a jack to load the bay if there was no bomb trolley available in wartime operations. However, the thuds carried very few bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was occupied by a further reserve of fuel on the outer wing. There was a provision for 2 stores pylons to be fitted. These could be used to carry weaponry and fuel in any desired combination, or removed to allow the attachment of specialized delivery racks for other armaments, like this installation for the Sidewinder. The standard build and armament for all Thunderchief variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at 6,000 rounds per minute and could fire off the entire 1,029 shells it carried in less than 11 seconds. Air Force deliveries continue with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron, becoming the first fully equipped with the new fighter and celebrating by setting a world speed record. In 1961, the first overseas deployments were made to bases in Germany. Far away from Europe, the summer of 1964, so the Thud goes into action for the first time. Soon, they were sporting new camouflage as they were deployed in larger numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From those bases, they launched the campaigns that were to write their name into history. For the F-105, Vietnam was the right place at the right time. Even during their service life, up to that time there had been continued problems with reliability, and as recently as 1962, they had all been grounded. Though those problems had been ironed out, the plague of minor defects and a series of accidents had continued almost up to their first Vietnamese missions. But the Thuds in Vietnam were to earn a completely different reputation as reliable and duro airplanes. They also earned a fearsome reputation as weapons. The importance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam can be simply indicated during the first 5 years of their involvement there. They flew an amazing 75% of all USAF attack missions. If the skies of Vietnam were full of bombs, it was because the thuds put them there. From March 1965, increasing numbers of airstrikes were made on North Vietnam, predominantly directed at communications targets. The raids relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air with their loads of bombs and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. But with the level of external stores they were carrying, and the way that increasingly they had to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam rather than cruising to and from the target, the range had been cut considerably, and even with full tanks, the journeys didn't leave much to spare. Then, they flew into hostile airspace. At the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese had only limited air defenses, and the earliest raids were relatively quiet. Soon, however, supplies on anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters began to multiply. And the raids were flown into the teeth of the most intensive air defense systems ever tested in warfare at that time. Production of the 105s had been completed in December 1964. Only 78 of the B model had ever been built. The remaining 610 had been F-105Ds. The D had acquired an extended nose, accommodating all-weather navigation systems, and thus was externally dissimilar to the B. The other 143 with a twin-seat F model. It had always been expected that there would be a twin-seat version of the plane, but 2 earlier twin-seat proposals had been dropped. The Fs were to provide the stock for the later development of the last 105, the G, the Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the D. The single-seaters are bounded on the bases where the work of war went on 24 hours a day. At the end of each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the performance of the plane and handed it over to him for service. The service record of the F-105s in Vietnam was excellent. On any given day, over 90% of the funds were ready for work. This figure was higher than the overall average within the USAF, and considering the complexity, workload, and relative scarcity of the big planes, it's all the more outstanding to keep them in the air. Facilities for total maintenance of the planes were built at the bases they flew their missions from, and specialist teams were constantly available to fly in to handle specific problems. Teams of ground crew at the bases carried out the normal turnaround routines, like refueling, filling the water tank in the tail for the afterburner, rearming the plane, and other servicing required between missions quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. The big fuselage had very little spare room inside it, but the layout was good enough to ensure that servicing was relatively straightforward. The bases were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief parked on Tackley's acres of hearthstand could be serviced with relative ease. The wing point combinations for the next missions were selected and affected, and the plane armed in the smooth and practice routine. A large part of the bombs that were dropped on Vietnam were iron bombs of the Second World War. Vintage, sadly, they were a part of a design philosophy and era that should have been long gone. However, modern smart bombs were not to really arrive in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the last phases of the conflict. So the F-105 missions were often flown to deliver hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, often unstable in trajectory and sometimes unreliable in effect. But with these bombs, the thuds hammered the North and in most instances destroyed their allocated targets right through the night. The bases were a hive of activity. At the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes went on. Another factor that makes the 90% availability of the thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage to repair. Thuds sustained strikes from SAMs as well as AAAs and mid-cannons and still survived. This one has actually survived a hit from a Sidewinder. Each morning, the one-man's air forces waited ready. In March 1965, the USAF flew the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of the reference to Thunder is fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was to be the almost exclusive province of the Thunderchief. The fuller extension of the air war into the North had 3 purposes. First, to reduce the infiltration of the South. Second, to give pause to the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the Southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, targets being progressively further and further over the border, and the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges and railways and roads extracted a great cost on the communists and hampered their war effort considerably. However, though at times apparently shaken, the Hanoi leadership did not break. The thuds flew in on their deadly missions, and the Vietnamese tried with everything the Russians and Chinese could give them to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets in the terms of docks and storage were within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the two major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the US consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting. The THUD pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of sands that rose of them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles. In tangles with the MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such reversive power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could in most cases simply accelerate away from them further. The thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and really mixing it up. 28 MiG-17s were down by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied craft in the air at enemy level, from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the mid-squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, served to ensure that for the large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were themselves part of a chain of command that stretched back from the Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the thuds, sending off daily with their loads. Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105s carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to not acknowledge the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds to do so reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, to be followed soon by others. The most critical fatigue concern was the strains upon the engines. The missions that the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly returning at full power with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already, there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, their normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours. And teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 388th Squadron was flying Thunderchiefs with 3,000 hours under its belt. Having gone out on 500 missions, received flag damage on several occasions, and have been involved in mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of the work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been much influenced by the story of the Thud and which had reflected many of the lessons learned in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the two-seater SAM suppressing wild weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support, and electronic countermeasure systems. The Thuds were still workhorses right through to the devastating Linebreaker 1 and 2 operations that finally brought the North to a negotiation position that allowed the US to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home and the results devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing halts, with trucks bumper to bumper, illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of bombing. With Thuds about, the trucks were far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thuds saw hundreds of pilots through their tour and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job and survived. However, many of them were still to miss their big machines and the sensation of howling through the air at a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Piawani began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge, near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the USAF after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There were not too many of them about, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve of an F-105 was on the 25th of May 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the 105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them consider their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was got right so well in one package. There were never that many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. Nevertheless, the plane was certainly outstanding.
Okay, my name is David B. Waldrop, W-A-L-D-R-O-P. So I was a first lieutenant when I did my combat tour in Vietnam. I actually flew out of Thailand at both Korat and Takali. I started at Takali. I was TDY from Yokota, but I was a first lieutenant my entire tour. I was fortunate enough to be born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, which I think is one of the greatest places in the world, especially in the 50s when I was actually growing up. You know, Nashville was a city. It had everything to offer that cities have, but yet just a little outside of town, it was rural. And my dad used to raise hunting dogs, bird dogs specifically, and we used to hunt and fish. And back then, you know, even as a young kid, I mean, when I started driving, I could knock on a farmer's door and say, "Sir, do you mind if I go hunting on your place?" And he'd take a good look at you and he said, "Do you know how to hunt? You know how to handle a gun?" I said, "Yes, sir. My dad taught me well." And he said, "Well, you're not going to shoot any of my animals, are you?" And I said, "No, sir. That's not what I'm here to hunt. I want to hunt some quail." And yeah, and they would let you do it. You think about doing that today, forget it. But I grew up there, and it was an awesome place to grow up. And you know, we could go outside when we were little kids before we started driving and everything. You'd go out on the weekends and stuff like that. Your mom and dad wouldn't see you all day long, but they weren't worried about you. You know, we were safe. And we'd wander all over the place. We spend more time outside because we didn't have video games, TVs even hardly back then. And so we were outside all the time, and usually barefooted. And so it was an awesome time. Man, it was, and looking back, especially now, it was an innocent period of time. You didn't have the preponderance of crime and all the social issues that otherwise the social aspect of things was great, and it was a safe place, and you felt secure, and you felt comfortable. So yeah, it was a great place to grow up. I went to Hillsborough High School, which was that was another great place because it was a good school. The teachers were good, and we didn't have a lot of kids that were mean or anything like that. School, it's a big school too, and so that was a great part. And then I tried to play football, and my dad actually, he used to play on one of those local teams, and I've got a picture somewhere. I wish I could find it. I've looked for it, showing this cast of characters. And I mean, these are guys that you wouldn't want to come up against on a football field. And I mean, they had the old leather helmets, and they took a team picture after a game, and I mean, they were nasty, covered with mud, and they looked the part. And you know, Dad wanted me to play football. Of course, that's just what dads, do with their sons, and I wanted to play. But I weighed all of about 120 pounds when I started high school. And I was a skinny mini, and I'm still not very big. And I'd go out there and they say, oh, you gotta hit the big guys low, and I'd run as hard as I could. I'd try to hit, we had a fullback that weighed 220 pounds. And I'd try to hit that guy when he's doing an in sweep, and I'd bounce off him like a little dog. But it was just, I said, good Lord, give me some weight, something to work with here. But anyway, so I didn't become a big football star, as you can well imagine. But I did try. And so, we did all the swimming and the fishing and skiing, and we had a lot of lakes around Nashville. And a buddy of mine and myself, we used to go duck hunting by ourselves. At 16 years old, we'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning on our Christmas break from school, and tow a boat down to Kentucky Lake, which is about 70 miles away from Nashville. You're 16 years old. Do parents let their kids do that kind of stuff today? I don't think so. And we'd go out there and hunt ducks, and we'd find ducks, and the ducks would come to us. We'd actually call them in and everything. I remember one time we went down there. I know this is probably gonna be long-winded, but we went down there. It was so cold, one of those fronts came through. We had a boat, and the water, because it rained first, and then when these flash freezes came in, it dropped down about 20 degrees. The boat froze to the trailer. So we get down there and back up trying to get this boat off the trailer. It won't come off, it's frozen to the trailer. And I pulled my pants off, my boots off, and I walked out in this ice water and literally rocked the boat and finally broke it loose. It's just what we did. And so it was great. And I had my first shotgun, I think, when I was 13 years old. And it was just a different time. But it was great. It was fantastic. TV came about probably, I guess, when I was somewhere in grammar school. And we had one of the stations in Nashville. There was only 3 at that time. Used to close out their evening broadcast at 11 o'clock at night with the poem High Flight.
I have slit the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, when never lark nor even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand, and touched the face of God.
with a 104 in the background doing rolls and just the clouds. And I mean, that just, it just grabbed me. Plus we had a guard unit that was flying F-84s, and although we weren't really near the airport, their pattern would take them pretty near our house, and they'd be in fingertip formation, you know, you'd see those guys, and I look up and, God, that's so cool. And nobody in my family had ever even set foot in an airplane. But that was it. When I was 16, I decided I was going to be a single-seat fighter pilot, flying in the Air Force. Not the Navy, not the Marines. I didn't even know the Marines had airplanes, actually. But not in the Navy, but the Air Force. That's just what I decided I was going to do. And so I pretty well oriented everything I did from that point forward to go that direction. And I got accepted to Vanderbilt University. Now, I'm not the brightest candle on the cake by any means, which Vanderbilt's a pretty tough school, but I did get accepted, barely. But they had naval ROTC. Well, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to fly in the Air Force. And so I knew, you know, I did enough research, and I found out that what I had to do is come out of college with a degree, and the best way to do it would be to go through ROTC, so you come out as an officer. Because I did talk to some I guess, counselors that knew, and so I said, I'm going to University of Tennessee. Well, that saved Mom and Dad a lot of money, because Vanderbilt was a private university, although, of course, I was living off away from home, but that was also good. And so I went to University of Tennessee, and once again, I could not have picked a better school for David Waldrop. Actually, I went by the name Barry, because my dad was called David, his dad was David, and so they call me B for Barry. That's what the B stands for in my name. And so I grew up being that, and so I went to University of Tennessee, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I met some of the greatest guys who I still keep up with to this day, and we get together every once in a while for reunions. I was in a fraternity up there, and that also was really, that was a maturing actual experience, because there were certain roles of leadership that you could actually assume by being in a fraternity, which I did. And I was never president or anything like that, but I did several different things that allowed me to grow up and mature in that respect. And so I had a lot of fun up there. In fact, I had so much fun, I spent 2 extra quarters before I could graduate. And but then finally, you know, I was ready to get on. I was ready to go start flying airplanes. And of course, I was very lucky. This is something also that's very important. To be medically fit to get a pilot slot in the military was really a critical and non-negotiable aspect of getting into a pilot's slot. Fortunately, I was medically completely fit. My eyes, my hearing, and everything, all that was satisfactory, so I was able to get a slot in pilot training. And I passed all the appropriate tests and so forth. So that's, you know, when I extended and stayed in ROTC, at that time, every male had to go through 2 years of ROTC at University of Tennessee. No choices. That's just the rules. But then if you want to stay on and get your officer's slot, then you had to, you know, the 3rd and 4th year, you also had to be in ROTC. And so that's what I did. And one of the guys in my fraternity was in ROTC, and so he started flying with me when I was a freshman. And I was able to start getting a little bit of stick time and getting the feel of it. And I knew that, you made the right choice, because that's the first time I flew in an airplane. And even though I'd never been in an airplane, I knew this was it. I mean, I'd get up there, and boy, the exhilaration and the excitement and just the feeling of making that airplane do something while you're up in the sky was fantastic. And so anyway, then your junior year, well, actually your senior year, you go to a 6-week military camp your junior year, but then if you're a pilot candidate, then your senior year they would send you to a local airport, where you'd actually learn to fly and get your wings. Not your wings, military wings, but you'd get, a pilot's license. And that was, I got about 35 hours there and got my pilot's license. And I remember one time we had a little airplane that's called a Shin 2150, which was a tandem seat. You sit one behind there. It looked like a miniature T-34. And I thought that airplane was just so cool. And I went up and I'd fly it. And I went up one day by myself and I did something I shouldn't have done, but I did it anyway. And because our commandant of cadets for the ROTC unit, they'd bring a T-33 jet trainer up periodically. It was tandem seat also, and I got to ride in it a few times. And of course, he always would do a roll and do some maneuvering and stuff like that. And I thought that was cool. So I get in this little Shin one day, and I said, I'm gonna do one of those rolls. So I didn't have a clue how to do a roll, and I sort of pull the nose up a little bit, and I put the stick over, and of course, in an airplane, once you get sort of like this, the nose is going to want to drop, and it did. And so I kept on. Here I am going straight down at the ground. I'm seeing the red line. I said, "Oh my God!" And I started pulling. And the G's, I felt the G's. That was cool. I like that. But I said, I ought to find out how to do this first. So I do it again. So I went in and I talked to Colonel White, and I said, by the way, you remember when you did that roll? How'd you do that? And so he started telling me. He said, no, you. I said, well, I wound up. He said, oh my God, don't do that anymore. That airplane's not even aerobatic. You're not even supposed to do aerobatics in that airplane. I said, oh, really? So I said, okay. So, anyway, I didn't do any more of those, but, and then of course, finally I graduated in December 1964. I was supposed to have, and this is sort of how, I had a lot of luck when I was in the military. And I really did, in a lot of places, a lot of different times. I was supposed to have a March class in the Air Force to go to pilot training. So I graduated in December. I was going to go home and I wouldn't report to Laughlin Air Force Base till March. And I about drove Colonel White crazy. I said, sir, I'm ready to go now. I've been waiting for this all my life. And he said, well, they come up with these assignments and everything. You got to just take what they give you. And I said, can you just talk to somebody, please? And so he's fine. Okay, I'll do my best. Well, damn if he didn't go talk to somebody, and I got a January class. So I wound up going in, and here's the irony of the thing. I wound up going in January, starting pilot training. The March class, and I can go into more detail, but I got an F-105 assignment. I had to work my ass off. But I got an F-105, which I wanted a single-seat fighter, and that was one of the 2 airplanes that I wanted to fly when I was 16 years old. And the March class, they didn't have any 105s. No, you'll never know how it changed my life. It completely oriented my entire life. And that was sort of interesting also when I was at pilot training. I'll skip the first part because it's T-37s. Everybody goes through the T-37s. But then a good friend of mine was a fellow named Pete Foley. He was in 6 months ahead of me. So in other words, we were going like this. So I go where he leaves. So, no, he was not. But he got an F-105 assignment also. And his instructor was a fellow named Chris Paterakis. And Chris Paterakis was a guard guy that had come back on active duty that used to fly fighters in the guard. So he was the real deal. And so Pete told me, we got to be really good friends. He said, Dave, you want fighters, you want an F-105 or an F-100, you got to get Chris as your instructor, and you're going to be taking our place. Let me introduce you to Chris, and maybe he can get you as his student. So he did, and so Chris did get me as one of his students. Well, the first thing an instructor does when they start out in flight training is they will sit down individually, student, instructor, by themselves. Say, what do you want out of this? What's your goal? Of course, Chris already knew what mine was. because I had met him and Pete had introduced me. He had told him, this guy wants fighters as bad as I did. Well, but when we sat down, what he said to me was, he said, I already know what you want. That's easy to say you want something. Now is when the test starts, because you're going to have to back it up. Because the other two guys, they really don't care what they get. They just want to get their wings. But you want something. And I'm going to be on your back 100% of the time. Nothing is ever going to be good enough. And you're going to have to work harder than anybody in this whole squadron. Are you willing to do that? I said, yes, sir. And I did. If I was 10 feet off, Dave, what's wrong with your altitude? Well, I'm working back to it. I mean, that's what it was the whole time. And finally, at one time, the coup de grace sort of came after we did our formation and so forth. I remember one time I was leading, and you know, you'd fly solo, and I was leading back into the formation, and they had turned the airport around because of wind changes while we were out, and I didn't know it, and I didn't get the information correctly, so I'm leading back the same way we started out, and all of a sudden over there, I've got the flight. Get on my wing. So I hopped on his wing. We go back out, re-enter. Oh my God. We got on the ground, and I mean, Chris walked over to my airplane, and it was everybody on the flight line could hear Chris just absolutely wearing me out all the way back in. Of course, I got a big old pink on that ride too. But my formation was good. And I was due a night formation sortie, and the wing commander at Laughlin and the squadron commander needed a night formation ride. So Chris set it up so that I did my solo ride with them. Now, when I was flying with Chris, we sort of were doing some pretty good, we were doing 90-degree wing overs. More than 45 was all you're supposed to be doing. We were doing 90-degree wing overs, and I'm hanging right in there. And Chris was he was absolute atom by smooth. If you've got somebody in your wing, this is what I'm learning to fly formation. He said, don't ever let them know they're even in a turn. Make it so smooth they don't even know they've started a turn. You know, he said that's the whole key. And so I get ready for this night formation ride, and Chris says, Dave, I want you to do exactly what we were doing the other day. And I said, sir, it's night. And I said, besides, we were supposed to be doing 45. He said, if they don't come back with their flight suits soaking wet, I'm gonna pink you. And of course it was a full moon. And he said, it's a full moon. Nobody will have any trouble seeing each other. So I went up, and I mean, here we are, night. 90-degree wing loads. And we get back on the ground, and I got in the room, and I saw Chris, and he said, well, did you? I said, well, I did what you told me, sir. So I'm standing about as far as me to Scott from Chris, and those two characters walked in. They were full colonel and a lieutenant colonel. They walk in, and they stop right in the doorway. And they look at Chris, and they looked over at me, and one guy didn't even turn his head, he just looked back at Chris. Did you put him up to that? Chris said, oh God, Dave, what did you do? And I said, I flew like you told me to do, sir. and Red Wine, who was the squadron commander, started laughing. He said, I think I have seen it all now. That's the first time I have done 90-degree wing overs at night on some brand new pilot's wings. And I passed. Anyway, the formation night flight was toward the end, and at that point in time, I had my F-105 assignment, and that was one thing that Colonel Redwine said, what kind of assignment did you get? And I said, I got an F-105, sir. And he said, well, you ought to do well. And we graduated. We started in January of '65. I graduated in February of '66, and then. We had, back then they used to group all the students from all the different training bases into one big list, and everybody was ranked according to their ranking, and also what their instructor, their recommendations, and so forth. And so anyway, they had 6 F-105s and they had 5 F-100s. Now those were the only single-seat fighters that we had. So we had 11 single-seat fighters and there were 225 students. So Chris got me my single-seat fighter. And I went to Nellis, and my class though didn't start till May. So I had really February to May. I wound up going to survival school up at Reno at Stead Air Force Base, which was great since most all of us were going to Vietnam. So we have a February Stead survival school and had to wear snowshoes. That somehow or another going to Vietnam with snowshoes didn't seem like the right program, but that's what we did anyway. And so most of us were hopping backseat rides with instructors, which you could do, and you got you familiar with it, started getting you familiar with the airplane, that giant airplane. And our class started in May, I think it was, of '66. And now here's another interesting. So I had Chris Paterakis. By the way, what I didn't say about Chris Paterakis is this. He applied to the Thunderbirds while I was his student. Well, the 1st of January, he left me as my instructor, and he went to the Thunderbirds. He got selected to fly left wing on the Thunderbirds. So you can get a little bit of an idea of the mentality, the demand for perfection, the absolute acceptance of nothing outside the box. It had to be constantly the best of the best. Well, I go to Nellis and I get an instructor who doesn't have the same uniform as the rest of the Air Force guys. He's a Navy exchange pilot by the name of Harley H. Hall. And I'll tell you, then I'll give you the rest of the story. When I'm out there just starting formation flying with Harley, over the air, for everyone in the world that's on the frequency to hear, Dave, smooth, smooth, smooth as the skin on a maiden's breast. Every fighter pilot that was on that frequency, of course, had to chime in and jump in on top of Harley. But you know what Harley later became? Blue Angel lead. Oh yeah, we lived off base. I was living in an apartment right off the strip. Wow. I tell you what, for a bachelor in the only problem was I didn't have any money. I had a red Corvette, and 1/3 of my paycheck, and I mean 1/3 of my paycheck, was going to my car payment. But I had my little red Corvette. I was a fighter pilot. You got to do what you got to do. You can't drive old junk heap around. That was, and of course at that point, it was everything Nellis had ever been, because Vietnam was full board, and so everything we did, and we flew when I was learning to fly. I mean, they were pushing, and we were getting really aggressive. We were getting low. We were getting fast. We were getting demand. They were pushing us as far as we could go as students, because they had to get us ready, because most of the guys were going straight to Vietnam. And the 105 used to be, it was so complex and so fast. In fact, the final approach speed on the 105, on the single seat model, was 185 knots. Now that's basic, plus fuel, 5 knots per 1,500 pounds of fuel over 1,000. So you were coming down final about 190 knots. That's over 200 miles an hour. It's the fastest landing airplane we had in inventory. And at one time, you had to have 500 hours of tactical fighter time to get in the 105, because it was so complex, because it had terrain following radar. It had a fire control system that was extremely capable, but is also very complicated. And so a guy like me, back in the early days, I wouldn't have even been able to get a 105 assignment. But Vietnam changed everything, because then they needed to bring in fresh blood. They needed to bring up guys. So those of us that instructors felt could handle the airplane got to have the opportunity to fly it. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. Actually, my whole class got orders to go to Yokota Air Base. And we all thought, well, gosh, I thought we were going to war. And we had 6 guys in my class, and all of us went to Yokota. And that was because they needed to fill in Yokota, which had a nuke alert commitment, and they had to keep that fully manned. It's the best thing, once again, that ever happened to me. Because when I got over to Yokota, I wound up in the 35th Squadron, and there was a captain there by the name of Robert Spielman. Called him Spiels. And he was sort of a country guy also, in terms of he liked to hunt and fish. And so we just hit it off, and they had a couple of motorcycles there, and so we started riding motorcycles together, and we got to be really good friends, and he was a weapons officer. So we would fly a lot together simply because he could fly with me. And once again, I mean, he just pushed, he pushed, he pushed. He let me lead, and when lieutenants were not even supposed to be leading, but when I was with him, he would always make me lead part of the flight, get on the wing, and he would always maneuvering the airplane, always working me out. And he let me do stuff that none of the other lieutenants over there even got to do. And I know one time lieutenants were never supposed to ferry an airplane solo from Osan, which is where we did our Osan Korea, which is where we did our nuke commitment. And so we were going to come back together. There was 2 airplanes that needed to come back to Yokota. So I was in one airplane, he was in another one. We'd get up, fire up, and get ready to go. And his airplane goes down. Now, he's supposed to have cut me off at the same time. He didn't. He said, Dave, we need to get that airplane on back. I'll take the heat. So I took it on back. Well, halfway back to Yokota, I had a complete electrical failure. Here I am by myself at night, and I have a complete electrical failure. And it wasn't an overcast. It was, you know, I didn't have a visibility problem. So I wound up bringing the airplane back to Yokota by myself, had stuck a little pistol flashlight up in my helmet to shine on my instruments we had standby instruments over on the right side of our main instruments. They were gone, but we had little standbys. So I got back to Yokota with the airplane, and Spiels never anything ever came of it, because they didn't really, the head guys never knew about what took place, other than, you know, one came back with an electrical failure. That's all they knew. But Spiels said, I knew you could do it. I said, I wasn't planning to do it this way though, sir. And we went out one day on a DART mission, in fact, right before I went to Vietnam. And this was sort of interesting too. I was flying number 2 on Spiels' wing. Now DART, do you know what a DART is? It's a long silver winged device that is towed behind another airplane. In our case, we towed it with a 105. And they would let the DART out, and then when he starts a turn, he'd clear you in, because he wants to be out of the line of fire. You'd be off to the, for instance, like on the right side, he'd start a right-hand turn, so he's clearing. Well, then you shoot it, you come in, roll in on this DART, and you shoot at it to you know, learn how to air-to-air shoot. And it's hard, it's not easy, it's not a real big target. So Spiels went in and he didn't hit it. And so I came in and blew it away. I come off and get on his wing. We had 2 other guys, and one of them was the 5th Air Force, one of the colonels. Colonel Batzel, actually was his name. And he was flying number 4. Well, number 3 comes in, he fires, didn't hit it. Well, they had a DART spare, I'm sorry. I hit one, then they had to dispatch that one. They had a DART spare airplane, because this was real critical. We all got our air-to-air renewals. And so they brought in the spare. So number 3 goes in, he didn't hit it. Number 4 went in, and his gun jammed, so he didn't hit it. And so Spiel says, well, we still got a DART. I'm fired out. Anybody got anything? And so I waited, because I'd already got a DART. And he said, Dave, how about you? And I said, well, I might have something left. He said, go for it. I went in and I did press, and I hit that thing, and I mean, it literally just it exploded, and I had a high G over the top over the thing. We got back on the ground, and Colonel Batzel said, "You are really pressing on that target." And before I even had a chance to open up spill, said, "Sir, this is one of the things we've been trying to ingrain and teach into our drivers, is sometimes they're going to have a close-in shot, and they need to have the flexibility and be prepared to handle these situations." So I got 2 darts on one mission, that's pretty cool. I mean, that was right before I went to Vietnam. Okay, when I first got to Yokota, I wanted to. The guys were walking around at Nellis with this 100 mission patch, and I really wanted that 100 mission patch. It was one of those goals that I had, is to get that 100 mission patch. So when I got to Yokota, I went down to personnel, and I volunteered for Southeast Asia. And I didn't have a clue at this time. I was the only one that had volunteered to go to Southeast Asia. So in May, I think it was April or May of '67, and like this was right following those DART missions that I had, they got an order to send 5 guys TDY from Yokota to Takali Air Base to fly combat mission. I was just a lieutenant, and I was the first one called up because I was the only one with a volunteer statement. And so then, of course, there's a lot of guys who wanted to go. They just hadn't thought about putting in a volunteer statement. And so anyway, they filled up real quick. So 5 of us went down, and we went to Takali, and I wound up going to the 357th Squadron. It was the 355th Wing at Takali and the 357th Squadron, and got to fly with some really, really great guys. And then this is where the rubber meets the road, as the saying goes. And once again, this is where my 6 months of experience with the 105 really, really, really paid off. Because I knew the airplane extremely well, because like I said, spills had pushed me. So I was able to assimilate into that role pretty quickly and effectively. Nobody had to worry about where I was. I was always going to be where I was supposed to. I was going to do what I was supposed to do. And because I knew the rules, and I knew why the rules were there. And that's part of the training that I had gotten. And so started flying. The first 10 missions you fly, they get you easy missions, the lower route packs, or I even had some Laos missions, which we weren't in, but I had some Laos missions anyway. Dang. Those Blue Jays are really raising cane back there. Then you start flying Route Pack 6. Now, Route Pack 6 was not a friendly place to be because they had more guns, missiles than anything, from what I've been told by the old heads, that we ever faced. And the flak sometimes would really be horrendous. But one mission, it was sort of interesting, actually, because when I first started flying the Pac 6 missions, the guns were quiet. I couldn't believe it. We'd roll on the target. I was expecting all this stuff to come up, nothing. And then July, I think it's 4th or 5th came along, and we're going against Kep Airfield, and I'm flying, I think, in the second flight. Bob White was leading. He flew with our squadron, actually, and he was leading the force in against Kep Airfield, which is on the Northeast Railroad, which is northeast of Hanoi. That's why they call it the Northeast Railroad. And anyway, we roll in, and all of a sudden I see something I hadn't seen before, and these red streaks were going by my cockpit. And it took a little bit for me to realize that's flak. It hadn't gone off yet. That's the flak going up. And then this horrendous explosion took place right underneath me. And I mean, it literally, I'm in a 45-degree dive, and I was doing 550 knots. It literally, it was like somebody took you and hit you in the back as hard as you could. And it's just, I mean, the whole airplane just completely just moved, and it rolled me upside down. Here I am going straight 45 degrees down to the ground, upside down now. And I thought I'd been hit. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind that I'd been hit. And I checked my gauges real quick. And this is where, knowing the airplane, everything felt solid. And so I kept the roll going, and I rolled it out. I checked the gauges real quick. Everything was still in the green. And so I continued. I dropped, came off the target, and I looked up and I saw a sight that I'll never forget. One of the guys on the first flight had been hit in the belly. We had a belly tank, and fuel was just pouring out, and he was a ball of fire all the way back. And give me a second. Anyway, I pulled up beside him, and he had a real high angle of attack, was climbing, and this fire was just pouring out of the back of his airplane. I pulled up alongside of him, and I didn't know for sure who it was, but I said, I'm out here to the left of you. I'm out to the left of you. You've been hit. Lower your nose. You got too high an angle of attack. You're going to lose it. Lower your nose. And the nose came down a little bit, and he said, it's getting sloppy. I heard him say it over the air. And I said, try to head a little bit, bring it over to the left more. And he said, I can't hardly see this, it's too much smoke. I said, roll a little bit left, roll left. Trying to get him out to the sea. Try to get him out where he could have a chance maybe to get out of the airplane. And he sort of rolled, but then he said, I'm starting to lose it, I'm starting to lose it. And I said, well, don't get out of it before you lose it, because what would happen if you got an angle of attack in the 105? If you got a high angle of attack, the nose would just slam down like this, and then when you punch, you're off the seat, and that seat comes up and hits you, but it can really hurt you bad. So I was trying to it was obvious he was going to bail out. So I said, get out of it before you lose it. Well, so anyway, he leaves the airplane. So I went back, I joined up the tanker, get home, and the crew chief, of course, they'd come up on the airplane and say, how'd it go? And I said, well, check the belly. I might have taken a hit. And he checked it. He said, yeah, there's a hole in the bottom of the airplane. And after that guy had gotten hit, 2 other guys got hit. So we lost 3 guys on that mission. And the guy that I tried to help was Ward Dodge, and he was basically my mentor when I showed up in the 357th Squadron. He's the one that taught me how to fly combat. And from that point forward, flak was the name of the game. And we had a lot of it, lost a lot of guys. In fact, the 105 community on the D model was a single seat version. We lost half the fleet of D models over there. And that just came to be part of the game, and you dealt with it. That's what you do. When we started flying, you got to remember it was a graduated process, and so the higher ups, I don't know whether this part of it was the military side or the civilian side, but they divided North Vietnam into what they call route packs. Starting from the DMZ, which was the dividing point for South Vietnam and North Vietnam. They started working their way north. Route Pack 1 was right there north of the DMZ, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 was the entire Hanoi, Haiphong area. They further divided Route Pack 6, which was absolutely the worst place to fly, into A and B. The Air Force had A and the Navy had B. So ours was 6A missions, for instance. When we get a frag, the frag would be the orders for the next day. It would always have 3 targets: primary, secondary, and alternate. It was sort of funny because we were starting to get frags that come down 6A, 6A, 6A. So no matter what you did, you weren't going to get an easy one out of it. You were going somewhere up in Hanoi. And so it was sort of a standing joke, really. Well, at least our alternate's 6A today. And because a lot of times you'd go up there and the weather would be bad, and you wouldn't necessarily get get a mission in if the weather was bad when you got up there, because we had to have VFR conditions. We didn't do IFR bombing. And so everything was visual. But Hanoi, Pack 6A, obviously, like I said earlier, that's where the guns, the missiles, and the MiGs were operating. No, you want to get me mad, huh? No, I'm just saying that this is one of the things that we had to deal with that was difficult to accept. Everybody and their damn brother knew when the North Vietnamese had a bombing halt, all they were going to do is renew, rearm, and up the ante. They'd bring in more missiles. They would better disguise their gun sights. They would have opportunity for the MiG drivers to train more, because we basically had air superiority up there. They didn't have a chance to fly a whole lot when we were around. And they chose not to until basically August 23rd, 1967. That was the first time that they really came up and played during the time I was there now. I'm not speaking about before I got there. But they basically weren't able to come come up and fight that much because they just were so outnumbered. But we had to live with these bombing halts, and fortunately, I will admit, I personally was not involved in a bombing halt. The bombing halts took place before and after my time there, so I personally wasn't one of those that could really throw up the anger from allowing them to build up while I was sitting on the ground waiting for them to finish building up, then be told to go back up there. But that's what would take place. And they took full advantage of increasing their defenses every single time. It was stupid, absolute stupid. You know, anybody that has a brain of sense is, if you're going to go into combat, if you decide to go to war, then there's only one decision: kick ass and take names and get the hell out of there. Now, you got to give Bush credit for that. When we went over to Iraq, whatever the reasons were, we went in there in 6 days, it was done. It's a done deal. In our case, we couldn't even touch Haiphong Harbor. The ships would be sailing in and out of Haiphong Harbor. This is when I was there in '67. They'd be sailing in and out of that damn harbor, bringing in guns, missiles, fuel, you name it. We couldn't touch it. And all of our, quote, allies, the French and everybody else, were also sailing in and out of Haiphong Harbor. I say the French, I've been told that. I didn't see any French ships, but I have been told that they were coming in and out of there as well. And so I better back up on that statement. But they had total immunity. And our government would not even allow us to hit any of the ships. They wouldn't even blockade it and say, all right, guys, we're not going to destroy any of these ships, but you're not coming in there. You're not bringing the stuff in. They wouldn't even stop it. And that's where I have a hatred for Johnson and McNamara that will, the only day it will die is the day that I die. There I was, 40,000 feet, pulling 9 Gs, going to Mach 2, the 105. No, not quite. First of all, there is something I will add before I got to the MiGs, because the MiG situation actually occurred because of this thing I'm going to tell you about. I was down TDY, Takali. I had 45 missions, and orders came in sending the 5 of us back to Yokota, and then there was another 5 going to come down to take our place at Takali. That all made perfect sense to everybody, except for David B. Colonel Trays, who was my squadron commander at Nellis when I checked out in the F-105, had taken over a squadron at Karat, which is our sister F-105 wing. And he was the boss of the 44th Tactical Fighter Squadron. Well, I went down there to get my 100 mission patch. I think I mentioned that earlier. Well, I pick up the telephone and I call Colonel Trays. I say, "Hey, Colonel Trays, this is Dave Walter." Because we'd seen each other a lot because we had single runways at both Takali and Karat. So sometimes somebody would blow a tire, foul the runway, and we'd have to divert. You know, them coming to Takali, us going to Karat. So I ran into Colonel Trays a couple of times. But anyway, so I told him, I said, "This is David B. over here," or David B. Walter. I just said Dave Walter. And I said, I'm down here TDY from Yokota, which you knew about that. And I said, well, they're sending me home. I want to stay down here and get my 100. Do you need any experienced driver? I got 45 missions, 30 of them in Pack 6. And he said, get your fucking skinny ass over here. I'll take care of the paperwork. Now, you're going to have to edit that, but that's just what he said, and I'm not going to change it. And so I said, yes, sir. I packed my bags. Nobody had a clue what I had done. I didn't tell anybody because I didn't even think about it. He was going to take care of the paperwork. So, because they were giving us a leeway, a little bit of time, between leaving Thailand and getting back to Yokota anyway. So I packed my bag and I hopped on a C-130 over about 100 miles to the east of me, and I land, and I started flying the next day. And the only thing is, as I found out later, Colonel Trays hadn't taken care of the paperwork. So I'm over there without orders, just flying my ass off. And I mean, I started flying immediately because he had lost some guys, and then some guys had finished up and got their 100. So he was short-handed, especially experienced drivers. And when like I was mentioning earlier, our frags were starting to come down 666. So that's where we were going. And you don't want to take a brand new guy into Hanoi because, my gosh, anything in the world can happen. And the rest cap, if somebody gets shot down, knowing who to call, how to rest cap the guy, who to stay over him, who to go hit the tanker, and cycling. So there's a lot goes on a rest cap. And first of all, in the Hanoi area, generally, you're not even going to do a rest cap. That's the hard-hitting line on this whole thing is if you're in the Hanoi area, nobody's going to be able to come in and pick you up. If you can get out to sea, if you can get out to the west, to the mountains, to Laos or someplace like that, yeah, then we try to get you out of there. And I've been involved in a few of the rest caps myself. But that's why you didn't want a brand new guy just in the theater going downtown Hanoi, because there was a lot going on up there. I mean, you got to be flying your airplane. And so, anyway, I immediately started flying and full tilt Hanoi as soon as I got to Karat. And then, of course, the first thing Colonel Trays did with my background, he made me a section leader, which is I could fly 3 and 4. Lead for 3 and 4. As soon as I walked in the door, in fact, my very, very first mission was the first strike on the Demer Bridge. He put me as number 3. And then we got on the tanker, and lead, which was Major Bill Raitt, I think it was, he couldn't take gas. And Major Raitt said, Dave, you got more experience than anybody else in the flight. You got to lead. My very first flight at Karat, I led a flight downtown Hanoi. So that was, and there's a lot goes on when you're a lead. But anyway, what I'm saying is I was a section full-time, and so August 23rd was perhaps, and this will take a little bit of time to describe this because it really was the most involved and complicated mission that actually I flew in the Hanoi area. We were going against a big railroad yard, which is right across the Red River from Hanoi. Right across the northeast side of Hanoi was a railroad yard called Yen Vinh Railroad Yard. It's a big target, so we had our typical 4 flights of 105, a flight being 4 airplanes, for those of you that are not familiar with that. So a flight is 4 airplanes, so we had 4 flights of strike aircraft. They're all single-seaters, and so that's 16 airplanes. Then we had a flight of Weasel airplanes. They come in and snoop out the missiles, the radars, and that was a flight of 4. So we had 5 flights of 105s up there. Well, it was such a big target that the Air Force also attached 2 F-4 strike flights from U-Bahn of F-4s. And they got behind our flight. So we had 6 strike flights coming in on this target. Now we all come in pretty much together because we had what they call these LWIZIs, these devices that would help blank out the SAM missile radars. So we all came in together in a what they call a pod formation back then. Then Robin Olds, a flight of 4, was flying MiG cap to keep the MiGs off of us. And up to this point, like I think I mentioned earlier, there hadn't been any MiG activity to speak of. So we're heading up there, and we drop off the tanker, which you refueled when you're on a PAC-SIS mission. You always refuel going in and coming off. So you got pretty proficient at refueling airplanes. You can do it almost in your sleep. And so whereas we're coming up there, we had some Snoopy airplanes out off the coast that had what we call them Big Eye, and they had radar coverage of North Vietnam, and especially Hanoi when we were going in. They started calling bandits, bullseye. That means MiGs taking off Hanoi, bullseye being Hanoi. MiGs are taking off in the Hanoi area. So I said, whoa, that's something different. And so they start tracking them, and we're coming in that afternoon from the west. Sometimes we'd come in from the ocean, the Gulf, and most of the time we came in from land over on the Laos side. And we were coming over from Laos that day. So we came up. There's a big ridge called Thud Ridge, which basically ran southeast, northwest, and it ran toward Hanoi, and it almost pointed right at Hanoi. So we were going around the north side of that, and as we're starting to get our track, the call-outs for the MiGs and their position and their headings it was obvious. And by the way, this was an afternoon sortie. Where's the sun in the afternoon? It's in the west. It's in the lower part of the west. And what the MiGs were doing is they were going out to the west, then they were going to turn and come in out of the sun where we could not see them. Then that's that goes all the way back to the earliest combat airplanes, is you always try to come out of the sun if you're going to attack somebody. And that's what they were doing. They were MiG-21s, and so they came from the west, and so the force commander, I can't remember his name right now, who was leading the whole force in, he said, Robin, make sure you keep those guys off of us. And Robin says, we're working and we're trying to find them right now. Well, this is one of those cases where the MiGs won out and they came out of the sun. They were doing 1.2 Mach. Now that 1.2 Mach is 1.2 times the speed of sound. speed of sound being 760 miles an hour at sea level. Now at altitude it's less, so they were probably doing close to, oh, maybe 600, 700, 800 miles an hour. So they're moving on, and they're if you look at a MiG-21 head on, there's not much to see. It's a very, very small profile. The wings, the intake, it's not a lot of airplane if you're looking at it head on, so they're very, very difficult to see. And they did it right. I mean, these guys, they did it right. I got to give them credit. They came in, they launched off 2 of their ATOLs. An ATOL is a heat-seeking missile, just like our Sidewinder. Same deal. And they knocked 2 F-4s down right behind my flight. Remember I said something about luck? And they were right behind my flight, and had they not been there, who knows? But they caught the brunt of the MiGs, and they knocked 2 of them down. And so now we got mayday calls, beepers. When you bail out of an airplane, or bail out, you don't bail out, you eject. When you eject out of an airplane, you got this beeper that goes off. It sort of makes it sound like a whoa, 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 whoa. And you can hear it over guard frequency, which everybody monitors. So we got all these beepers going off. We got mayday calls, you're on fire, get out of it, and all this stuff. All this crap's going on. We're still heading for the target. We ain't even got there yet. And so Robin gets tied up trying to help these guys. And of course, you're not, like I mentioned earlier, there is no rest cap in the area we were now in. You just don't even, you're on your own. Because the helicopters, they can't get in there. It's just too heavily defended. So we press on. This is what you do. That's what you do. You don't sit there and just everybody say, oh, I'm going home. You keep on trucking, doing what your mission is. That's what we're paid to do. That's what we signed up for. And by the way, speaking of signing up for, every one of us flying fighters, we volunteered to fly fighters. And this was a big distinction between myself, ourselves, and the poor kids down in South Vietnam. They were drafted. They had no choice. They were sent over there to fight a political war, and they didn't have a choice about what they did. We all put our name on the line voluntarily. And I don't know why, that just was something I did want to bring out. There's 2 separate wars, 2 totally different wars. Our war was a air-to-air, air-to-ground war. It was a sterile war. We never saw faces. We never saw any blood and guts. We saw airplanes. We saw targets. Never saw a face. Those poor kids down there, different ball game. And I don't think anybody that's there, unless they've been through it, including myself, can never appreciate, what they were faced with. But getting back to my story. So we press on in. We're going into the target. And ours was the third flight. Because like I said, we were staggered at the back, and the flights are staggered like this. Lead would be here, 2nd flight, 3rd flight, 4th flight, like that. I don't know whether you get that on the camera, but otherwise, anyways. And that's why I said, if the F-4s hadn't been behind me, then I would have been in line for the MiGs that came in, or my flight would have been. I might have been lucky, I don't know. But we get in the target area. We're the 3rd flight in, and I now have, about 600 hours or so in fighters, and I'm going in, everything is set, you check your radar, your fire control system going in, you always line up on another airplane just to check, get everything, make sure everything's working properly. And the 105 had the most sophisticated fire control system of any fighter flying in North Vietnam, period. It had the latest and greatest, and it worked terrifically, as I described on the Dart. That was a good example of it. It works, especially if you know how to use it and you're smooth. And as I'm turning in, and we're at what's called a push-up point. That's when you leave the cruise mode, and now you throttle up, and you're picking up to about 550 for your roll in. That's 550 knots, about 650 miles an hour, something like, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, I'm looking, you have what's called a reticle. It's projected up in front of you. And in our case, it's red rings with a dot in the middle. That's the pipper. The dot is the pipper, and you put that on your target. And so I'm just trucking along, everything's looking great, and all of a sudden, my reticle goes, and it's gone. And so I didn't think anything about it at the time, because we're about 15, 20 seconds from roll-in. And the last thing in the world you're going to do is try to start screwing around with stuff and see if you can figure out how to get it back. And I didn't really know for sure what was wrong. And so I said, well, I've done this bombing mission plenty of times, so I can figure it out. You know, I'll use the TLAR method. That looks about right. TLAR. And so I rolled in, and sure enough, I used my TLAR, and I released my bomb. So I'm coming off, and we had pre-briefed to turn hard to the north for our join up, because you always operate as a flight for mutual protection, especially when there's MiGs in the area. And there were MiG-17s all around the target, but none of them posed a threat to us, so we didn't fool with them. Our job was to bomb the railroad yard. But now I'm coming off, and I'm pulling about 6 Gs, coming off the target, doing about 600 or so knots, and I'm back out of burner because you want to save your gas. You don't want to, but I'm still doing 600 knots. 105 is fast. That thing was just so beautifully fast. And I look up, though, as I'm making my turn to join up with the flight, and I see an F-105 heading west. He's got 2 MiG-17s right on his butt. The lead MiG is directly in trail with the 105. The second MiG was off to lead MiG's right side and staggered aft. And I saw that, and then I saw the fire coming out of the MiG's nose. He was shooting at the 105. And so I hollered out over the radio, because I didn't have a clue who the 105 was. I just said, 105 heading west, you got 2 MiGs on your ass, do something. And he just kept on going. He probably didn't hear it, or he'd already switched over to a different frequency, which we normally did. We'd go to squadron common, because there's so much chatter. If you're trying to join a flight up, it's really difficult with all that, because you can't talk over somebody else. So you'd switch immediately over to squadron common. So that's probably why he didn't hear me, and I didn't hear him, or whatever. And so then I made my decision. I had to go in and get these MiGs off his tail, or he was going to be dead, or at least shot down. And so I hit what's called a panic button. There's a button over on the right side of the cockpit, and when you push this button, it cleans everything off the airplane except the outboard stations. And since I was flying number 3, I had a Sidewinder on my left station. Sidewinder, once again, is a heat-seeking missile that you can use in an air-to-air environment. And so I had that, and I pushed the nose over and lit the afterburner to accelerate as quick as I could. I went down, I lowered my nose so I could pick up speed as quick as I could, and also to go more, because it was almost like this, and I wanted to get more in trail. So I went low and down so I could come up below them so they couldn't see me coming. And that all worked. I mean, I got that down pretty good. And the last thing I saw, though, when I started my pull, I looked at my airspeed indicator, and I was doing about 1.3 Mach. That's 1.3 times the speed of sound. I mean, I'm smoking. But for a good reason, because that MiG is still shooting at the 105. How he had missed him up to this point, I will never to this day know. Because he was dead trail. The 105 did not know he was there. He was just going straight and level. He was only doing about 400 knots. Because the MiG didn't even have his afterburner on. And the MiGs had afterburners if they needed the extra speed. He didn't even have it on. So the guy was breaking all the rules. Number one, coming off the target, you got the throttle up, you're hauling ass, and you got the stick in your lap, and you're moving the airplane. We call it jinking. You constantly do this, and what you're doing is 2 things. If somebody is back there, you're killing their tracking solution, and number 2, you're looking for other MiGs, because also you are in charge of helping defend your own flight. So you want to see if there's a threat somewhere in your back, back that that's not in front of you. And so you're really looking hard. And so I came off that target. I was pulling 6.5 Gs. and I, doing this when I saw what was going on. So this guy's just going straight and level, the 105. So I come up, and my sidewinder is on, and it's growling. Growling's audio means it's got to lock on to a heat signature. The heat is coming from the back of the airplane. That's where the engine exhaust comes out. So it's looking at a heat source. The lead MiG was so close to the 105 though, I didn't know whether the sidewinder was looking at the 105 or whether it was looking at the MiG, which would have been great if I could discriminate, but I couldn't. And I didn't have my sight, damn it. And so I couldn't really, I didn't have all that working for me. And so I decided I could never live with myself if I had turned that sidewinder loose and it had gone to the 105. I don't know what I would have done. I could never have accepted that ever. And so I turned the volume down on the missile, and I said, well, I got to go in with a gun. Well, remember earlier I was talking about that thing, that round thing with a pipper in the middle of it? Well, that's what you use if you're going in air-to-air wise to shoot at another airplane. So I didn't have that, but I said, well, I've shot the gun. It's somewhere out there, somewhere in the middle. And so I came up, and I went after the second MiG first, because I didn't want to go past him for the lead MiG, because then the second MiG would have a good shot at me. So I had to be smart and just try to bust these guys up. And so I went after the second MiG, and actually that's when I realized how fast I really was going. I'd seen my airspeed indicator, but I realized how slow they were going. That's a better way to put it. It's because all of a sudden I started seeing this closure, and I realized I am really closing fast. And so I opened up on the second trailing MiG, and I did a rake, and I thought I saw flashes on his left wing. And now I'm pulling, I did about a 6 or 7 G pull vertical to stay behind these guys, because the 105 is not a turning airplane. So I had to really crank to stay behind him, which I did. And I go up through a broken layer of clouds, and I'm sitting up upside down, just floating there like this, literally upside down. And all of a sudden, underneath this broken layer of clouds, out comes this MiG-17. Now this one had his afterburner going. That's the difference. The other two did not have their burner going. So I don't know whether it was one of those guys, another guy, or if after I came through and I got them off this 105's tail, then they lit their afterburner to get some speed. That may be what happened. I'll never know. Nobody will know. But I saw that, and so I said, oh my gosh. And so I pulled down, and I mean, he did not know I was there. So he's just driving straight, and he's trying to get his speed up. Well, he's dealing with a speed demon when you're talking about a 105, because we were the fastest thing below 10,000 feet and flying. And so I came right down on top of him, and I opened up, and the first bullets went right through the cockpit. Then started working down the side of the airplane. And I did not realize this at the time, but while I'm actually hitting the MiG, a 105 actually came between myself and the MiG. He was slightly low, but apparently I'm hitting the MiG right as he passes directly between us. And a drop around must have hit one of his tanks, because a big ball of fire comes out from this 105. But all the 105s got home that day. That was the best part of this whole deal, because you don't really, in our world up there, our environment, you really don't have a chance to ever save somebody else's life. Because of the opportunities. I mean, when you're dealing with flak and SAMs, there's nothing you can do. You can't go over there and help a guy with his airplane. It's his ride, and there's nothing you can do to help him. So if you get hit by MiG or by flak or SAMs, then you're on your own. But in this particular case, I was able to get there, clean these MiGs off this guy's tail, and every 105 got home that day. And the only thing is, and this may be hard for some people to comprehend, considering the hostilities and the environment that we were operating in, we still had a code of ethics. There's probably a better choice of words. I don't have it at my grasp right now. But if I had had the sight that was working, and since he didn't know I was there, I would have probably gone for his engine or one of his wings. I would not have gone for him personally. And in fact, when I got back to Karate, the first thing everybody's seen the movie Top Gun, and you know when the guys land on the carrier deck, everybody's around them. You know, well, actually I have a picture of that, and that same thing happened to me. But the first thing everybody asked, did he get out? And I had to say no, he didn't get out, because everybody respected the fact that he was another kid or guy who was doing what he loved to do, and he was in his own way protecting his country. So he wasn't like, it wasn't personal to me. But so I would have not gone for the cockpit. But I didn't have the sight, so you know, I had no choice. I did what I had to do, and I wouldn't change anything, but I regret that the guy didn't get out. The epitome in combat for any fighter pilot is to take an opportunity to engage an enemy airplane, in our case a MiG, and to actually accomplish the task of shooting it down. I mean, it sort of puts you into another group. And no, there weren't that many. Now, and I do want to say this. There were two MiGs. When I got back to Karate, I claimed a kill. I knew I had this guy. I didn't know whether I got the first guy or not. And to this day, and I'm just, for the record, I've said this before, I don't know for sure what took place. But what did take place is, and the reason the wing gave me credit for two, and the official Air Force record is only one, but all they had to go on was film documentation, I guess. But that night, I'm going to have to really doctor this up, because the actual language that took place, I don't think I can quite, maybe I can bleep it. That night, we're getting ready to do our mass debrief. The mass debrief, when you go to Hanoi, when you come back, all the flights get together in one room. Force commander stands up in front of all of us. We're all in the room, and the intelligence officers in there, the wing commander, the vice wing commander, everybody, you know, a lot of the squadron commanders would come in because they want to know what took place if they weren't on the mission, because not everybody is on every mission. And so this was a big one though. And so the room was pretty full. So the force commander's up there getting ready to start, and he starts talking about some of the stuff that took place. Well, the sergeant comes in, and we're down at where all the intelligence people were also located, and I think they were in the same building. But anyway, the sergeant comes in, and I think that our intelligence officer was a major. He said, "Major Umpty, we got a call from U-Bahn." And so this guy says, "Could you hold the brief till I get back?" So we'd all just sort of milling around, standing around talking. And so pretty soon he comes in. He had this funny look on his face. He said, "Lieutenant Walter, no, what? You claim you got one MiG?" I said, "Yes, sir. That's what I claimed. I got one MiG. I know because I saw him hit the ground." Well, that was Colonel Oles, and he just called, and he wanted to speak to me. And when I got on the phone, he said, "Who is this?" And I identified myself as Major Umpty, and he said, "Well, this is Colonel Oles over to U-Bahn, and I want to confirm a kill for one of your guys over there flying thuds." It was, and it's in that letter. He said it absolutely was the most spectacular thing he had seen in that whole tour he had over there. A little while later, I got a letter from Robin, and because they were going to have the review board, and one of the guys that was on it, in fact it was Bob White, actually told me about the review board coming up. He said, if you got any kind of documentation, you might want to try to get it down there, because all they got to go on is just strictly right now the film, so forth. Anyway, so I contacted Colonel Lowell then, and so he wrote me this letter, and it says, Dear Lieutenant Walter, here's my observation. Based on vivid recollection, passed it on to the 7th Air Force, and they were the ones that were going to do the review and so forth. And finally, let me know, and he said, if that doesn't work, let me know and I'll redo this. So anyway, he said, as far as I'm concerned, you got the first MiG without any shadow of a doubt. As to the second, the film showed hits. What happened after that will require confirmation by you and anyone else in the 388 that saw it or saw a shoot, which of course, like I said, nobody else saw the engagement except Robin, and the man didn't get out of the airplane. And remember, I saw no shoot connected with that first MiG. None of our troops went down in the vicinity that day, so if anyone saw a shoot north or northwest of Fukien, it had to be your second MiG. And may I say in passing, and this is the neat part, may I say in passing that the sight of your thud hot on the tail of a MiG-17 shooting like hell and scoring hits was one of the most thrilling sights in my whole tour. You look like a shark after a minnow. By the way, after that, I wound up with a call sign. It was shark, and I still get called shark today. Shark after a minute. I couldn't help shouting at you, go get them, thud, breach of radio discipline, I know, but it was a beautiful moment. All the best to you and good luck with your claims board. And it says, hell, we fighter jocks know you did it, never fear, and have fun in the F4. Because I was telling him that since we lost our thuds at Yokota, that we were going to pick up F4. So that's where he was coming from on that. It's not a bad bird at that. Robin Owens. I know he did not want to leave. He in fact, I remember talking to him after I got to know him, and he said, you know, I didn't really want to get my 5th kill because they would have pulled me, and I still had work to do. That's exactly the words he used. He said I still had work to do. He was the real deal. I mean, he was probably, and I will take nothing away from our leadership because we were lucky. God, I flew with some of the greatest leadership and commanders, and I think about the leadership we got in this country today up in Washington, and I think about the difference between those guys and the real deal, the guys that were leading us, that were actually feet on the ground with us. And when that's not really true, feet in the air. Those guys were the real deal as far as leadership. The guys, bozos in Washington, they don't have a clue. But he was probably, in really getting to know Robin after the fact, knowing about him through his peers, the people that actually flew with him, that were with him at Ubon, he was probably the finest combat commander that the Air Force has ever had. I think I could go out on a limb and say that, because not only was he the epitome of a jock, a fighter jock, he was a leader. When he walked in the room, there was no doubt who was in charge. You knew immediately who was in charge. And for those guys that got to fly with him, when he was in charge, they had that warm, fuzzy feeling. This guy knows what he's doing and he's going to take care of us. Like if he hadn't just been where he was, nobody else in my flight even saw me tangle up with him. I was solo as far as everybody in the nobody in the 105 community even saw what took place. He just happened to see it. So it's not something that and it happens so fast. These engagements don't last. I mean, in the movies you see these games where they just go, oh, this is not. It doesn't work like that. Not in our environment with the fighters and the speeds that we were dealing with. Because first of all, normally, anybody that would have had any sense would have boogied out of there. But in my case, for some stupid reason, I was hanging upside down. I was looking around, don't get me wrong, I was still clearing my 6. But I was just happened to be upside down when I saw this other MiG. Normally, the environment we were operating in, you're not going to hang around. That's not very good for your health. And so that just happened. I don't know if it's single other confirmation by some other pilot, really. I'm sure it may have taken place. I'm just saying, I don't know of any. And but it was special because I did get to know Robin through an organization called Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. The very first one I attended when it was back in the States. It was at Wichita, Kansas, at McConnell. And one of the guys asked, knew of that deal, and he said, "Have you ever met Robin?" I said, "No, is he here?" And he said, "Yeah, let me go introduce you to him." So I met him, and I mean, it was great. It was just awesome. He was a bigger than life guy, and I mean, he just lit up like a Christmas tree. So you're the guy. He stuck out his big paw, and it's cool. And, but anyway, I got to talk to him several times, and then I got to know him through some friends of mine as well. And so, but he was really a super guy. I think he's probably the only guy that ever took on the President of the United States. Well, on October 28th, just to make sure that there wasn't anything that flying in a combat environment might have to offer, we took off on an early mission. We were going downtown Hanoi. I mean, as in 2 miles southeast of Hanoi on a target. And we took off before sunrise. The sun started coming up right as we were flying. We were heading to the east, so that means in a fighter, you're flying formation, remember, and it's you got lead, 3, 4, 2. It's like that, and you're flying sort of a loose formation. You're not flying tight, so you just relax. But the sun's in your eyes. Well, when the sun's in your eyes, you really can't see any lights in your cockpit. And as the wingman, which I was flying off the lead because I was flying number 3, I'm looking over there. I'm not looking at anything in my cockpit anyway. And so finally we get ready to turn south to join up with a tanker. Well, when we turn south, all of a sudden I see this master caution light on in the cockpit. And I said, where'd that come from? And so in the 105, you had the master caution light and you had a warning light. Well, this was a master caution. But then it takes you over to a panel that has a series of system lights. And one was lit up and it said oil quantity. Well, when you take off, you're always above a half, more like 3/4 to full on the oil quantity. Mine was at a half because the light was on, it said oil quantity. Well, we have a gauge as well, so there's a lot of redundancy there. And so I looked down at my gauge, and sure enough, it's at half. And so I called that out to lead, and I said, I've got a master caution. It's saying oil quantity, and I'm sitting on a half right now. And he said, well, keep an eye on it. If it drops, get out of here and try to get to Udorn, which was the closest base at the time. And sure enough, I saw it, and it was just creeping down. So I told him, I said, hey, this thing I'm losing this oil. And he said, hey, head for Udorn, take 4 with you as a chase. So we peel out and head off to Udorn, which is about 30 miles away. Well, I was loaded down. Of course, I still had fuel in my tanks, still had a load of bombs, and it was still dark down below us. And so I could see a bunch of little lights from the villages and everything, and I didn't want to get rid of that stuff, and I needed to get rid of it because it's drag. I wanted to be able to stretch the range as much as I could on that airplane in case I lost my oil. And so there was a range of mountains that I told number 4, I said, I'm gonna head over here so I can get rid of this ordnance over these mountains, try to stretch my range a little bit. So I started turning, and and it's like, all of a sudden I started feeling this. You probably can't see it on the film, but I'm shaking my hand, and there's this vibration just started setting in on the airplane. By this time, the oil quantity had completely dropped out to 0, so I had no more oil left. And normally the procedure is set the throttle at about 87%, and you don't leave it. And that's where they say you're going to get the best range out of the engine when you lose your oil. So I'm going over this mountain range, trying to get where I can punch all this ordnance and crap off the airplane. And about halfway around there, the vibration it's just like you took a volume knob and just slowly turned it up. And the vibration kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And so I called out to number 4 that's chased me. I said, the vibration is really picking up in this thing. And he said, yeah, you're smoking pretty good too. And I said, I don't know for sure I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna try to get over these mountains though, with this airplane. And it finally I got around to where I was over the mountains, and I was gonna punch the stuff off. The vibration had gotten so violent that I was literally, as strong as the 105 was, and it was a really, really well-built, strong, it probably took more battle damage, flak and stuff than any airplane flying. And I knew it was a strong airplane, but I couldn't read a single instrument in the cockpit. I mean, it was just a blur. Everything was a blur. And I said, this thing, I'm losing. I'm probably going to get out of it. And he said, well, I don't doubt that. You ought to see the back of your airplane. It's like 4th of July is coming early. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you ought to see the shit flying out of the back of your airplane. And so I said, yeah, that's it. And I said, I popped the rat. A rat is a ram air turbine. It's a little propeller that falls out once you turn it loose. It falls out of the side of the airplane. It's got a propeller that starts spinning up, and that will provide you with a generator so you continue to communicate, as well as it'll provide hydraulic pressure to run your flight controls if you lose your engine, because your engine is run from a hydraulic pump, or the hydraulic pump is run from the engine, and that's what provides the pressure for the flight controls. So anyway, that allowed me to talk and to fly the airplane. So I said, I'm shutting this damn thing down before it comes apart, and I did. I stopped cocked, and now I'm in the world's biggest, heaviest glider. And a glider in the 105 is like a rock falling, so you're not going to go very far. And so he said, well, make sure you get out plenty of time. I said, I'm going to get out about 10,000. And so sure enough, went down, pulled that handle up, pulled that trigger, and wow. And it squeezed the thing, and that rocket, well, the rocket doesn't fire at first. It was a shell that initially sends you up the track. It's got a cable that's actually attached to the rocket, because if the rocket fires, it could burn your feet and your legs and stuff. So anyway, went up, that thing went off, and what a ride that was. And I've still got neck and back issues to this day from that, as a matter of fact. But you know, everything worked. I floated my parachute. I landed in a big old tree, I think one of the biggest trees in Thailand, or at least the tallest. And I'm up here and I'm looking around, and we got one of these rappelling devices, and I started to use that thing, and I said, damn, I'm not sure that'll reach the ground. And of course, as a kid, I used to climb trees like every other kid did. So I said, and up there, naturally, the tree wasn't that big. So I pulled myself, I could pull myself over this branch to this tree. I climb out, I turn loose my parachute, and I start climbing down this damn tree. And I get down the last part of it, probably about the last 6 or 8 feet of the tree. It's so damn big, I got my arms spread as wide as I could, and I don't have any grip anymore. I'm sliding down. The only scratch I got were my forearms where I slid down this damn tree. And anyway, number 4, he got the helicopter. They came in, picked me up, and took me back to Udorn, and then I hopped on another flight back to Karat. They check you over, and the doctor, you know, goes over everything, asks you how you doing, all this kind of stuff. And so anyway, they take me back to Karat, and oh, I forgot to mention something earlier. Remember me talking about, because this came into play, about not having orders sending me to Karat? Well, Yokota found out where I was on August 23rd. I had been missing since about the 12th of August when I went from Takali to Karat. And then, of course, all the news media splattered that all over everything. That's when they found out that I'd gone to Karate. Well, what else didn't follow me to Karate was my medical records. And so I never even have, even to this day, there's nothing documented in any of my paperwork that I ejected from an airplane. The official Air Force records, at least. And funny thing was, I never thought a thing about it till about, 5 or 6 years ago. I was at a River Rat reunion and got to talking to one of the guys I was down there with, Dick Gall. And somehow or another that thing came up, and he said, by the way, Lieutenant, I got a question to ask you. That's what he always calls me, because he was a captain and I was a lieutenant. And he said, I want to know something. Since when do lieutenants write their own orders? And I looked at him and I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. It just didn't register. What are you talking about, Dick? He said, remember when you went to Karate? I said, yeah. He said, how did you write your own orders? I said, I didn't. I picked up the telephone, I called Colonel Trays. And he said, come on over, and I did. And he said, do you realize that you just changed official orders by doing that? And I had never thought a thing about that up to that point in time and space. And I did. I guess I did something that I wrote my own orders over there. Because Colonel Trays never got any orders made up for me. Oh well, you know. But you know, it was a hell of an experience. It was a hell of an experience. Working with the people I worked with is something I will never ever fail to remember and cherish. These people, these guys, just like the guys in South Vietnam, all of us knew it could be our day, that something wasn't going to go our way. But yet everybody put their boots on, everybody put their helmet on, they strapped that big beast on, started up, and away we went. And we did our job. And it was frustrating as hell dealing with the leadership that we had that wouldn't support us, that wouldn't allow us to win the war, which we could have done in a damn heartbeat. That leadership would not allow us to do it. Now I'm going to want to go one step further here. I also fault the JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because every single one of those guys should have gone on and written their careers off, and they should have resigned en masse and say, President, we can no longer work for you and the way that you're running this war and squandering our resources and our kids. And I mean, I hold them responsible for not having the guts to stand up and say, that's it, we can't support you. If that had happened, that whole thing would have changed immediately. I mean, the whole picture would have changed, because the president could no longer conduct what he was doing the way he was doing it had they done that en masse, said, sir, with all due respect, we can no longer perform our jobs.